This is Into Healing, and I'm your host, Mira Adura. Today's Into Healing guest is Hadar Cohen. Hadar is an Arab Jewish scholar, mystic, 10th-generation Jerusalemite, and founder of Malchut, a Jewish mystical school. Hadar weaves the spiritual with the political through art, writing, music, and ritual. In this lengthy but profound conversation, she shares what it was like to grow up in Jerusalem, to challenge set narratives, and recognize trauma, pain, anger, and grief. Hadar brings so much context, shifting a dialogue rooted in pain and oppression to justice, healing, and love. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and follow us for more transformational healing stories.
Hadar, I'm so moved to have you here. I've followed you from afar, and I've learned from you in so many different ways. Being around you is a process of remembering for me, a process of remembering our unity and our humanity.
That's beautiful. Thank you. That's really touching. Yeah, I think it's really difficult sometimes to be in the position that I'm in, that you're in, because there's so much pushing us into one direction. And yeah, what is it to really, stand in the middle and understand all of humanity? It's hard.
It's very hard.
It's really hard.
Yeah, so we have a lot of things in common. We're both very spiritual women that have deep ancestral ties to the same land, that has seen so much pain and suffering. Mm-hmm. In the time of our grandmothers, we probably would have been neighbors.
Definitely.
I've been feeling a huge amount of collective grief, and just trying to process it all has been huge for me. What has been happening and what has been happening actually for over a century. Mm-hmm. Before I start, I'd like to maybe just take a second where we could just honor all the lives that have been lost.
Yeah.
I'd also like to ask our viewers, our listeners, to come to this conversation with an open heart and try to just receive the wisdom and the healing of this conversation.
Amen.
So let's dig in.
Let's. Yalla.
You came straight from Jerusalem. Where's your heart?
My heart feels where it is always seeking to be, which is in this path or this dedication to God. And, I understand that sometimes even saying that word God, people are like, what is she talking about? But I feel that the path, the spiritual path, the seeking the divine truth, that to me has always been the most important thing. And I think that's the thing that has allowed me to, re-understand the narratives I grew up with, to re-understand politics, to re-understand other humans, to, when you have a connection to God, you can start to really see things differently. And I find that if you don't have a connection to God, you can be really consumed by your own story, by your own ego. And I've lived a life where I have been on many lands and I travel a lot, and I'm grateful for that. And I think because I've been in so many different communities, so many different cultures, it's like I really desire to see that face of God in every human and in every moment. And coming from Jerusalem, it's intense, it's hardcore. Like there's no words really to describe that level of pain, that level of horror, that level of just gruesome cyclical violence that, I feel like so many of us are looking for like the pause or stop button and we can't find it. And we're like, where is it? How do we press this button? And yeah, I think that one of the things that I'm committed to is, especially like I'm between Jerusalem and Los Angeles right now, and being someone who is a devotee, someone who is a woman of faith, it's really important for me to understand that God isn't just in, the new age spiritual life, but God is also in the suffering, and God is also in the pain, and God is also in the levels of brutality that we are constantly exposed to. And that's a really hard thing to reckon with. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. But I will say that faith, I think in the last couple of weeks, I've felt my heart and my faith grow stronger, which has been a bit shocking to me. Because, sometimes when we experience suffering in general, whether it's personal or collective, or there can be this feeling of, I feel abandoned. I feel abandoned by God. I feel abandoned by life. Where's my way out? But actually, and maybe this is like for the first time I've really ever felt this in a very like somatic way. I felt like my own soul mission in the last few weeks in a way, and that it just kind of sank in, which is like, oh, this is why I came here on earth. This is why I'm in this body. This is why I'm in this identity. And yeah, there's something really opening about that revelation of truth. And I'll share also that, in Jewish tradition, this is a big conversation, because there's a lot of scholars and theologians and people of faith who, after the Holocaust were like, how can we believe in God anymore? I mean, these levels of horror, there can't be a God, right? So there was a movement for more secular Judaism or a more cultural Judaism. And actually, if you trace a lot of Jewish history, you'll see that after there was a big massacre, genocide, whatever, on Jewish community, there was also this time of loss of faith. And for me, I feel like this is my spiritual resistance in some way, is to say I'm not going to lose faith, actually. That somehow I'm going to believe that God is still here. And this is where I lean on a Kabbalistic teaching that says that, God doesn't abandon us, but God hides from us. And when there's a lot of suffering, the light of God is hidden. And part of our task is to reveal the light. And that in different Kabbalistic lineages, that's in some ways the purpose of our humanity. So sometimes it's called tikkun, which means healing. But really that we're here for the revelation of God. And, it's a bit of perhaps of an intense thing to say right now, but, the bigger the suffering, the bigger the capacity for the revelation of light. So that's what I'm holding on to right now, is just that, that underneath all this suffering, that somehow there's still this light of God that's desiring to be revealed, and that we as humans are tasked with that process. And that's what I am choosing to be committed to.
That's beautiful. Can you tell us a little bit about how and where you were raised?
Yeah, so I was born in Jerusalem. My grandparents from my dad's side both grew up in the old city of Jerusalem. And, it's funny that I had this realization actually just this year, thinking about love and dating. And I realized that for the last 4 generations, all of my lineage, they've all met in the old city of Jerusalem. And I was like, oh God, I am never gonna, coming to Jerusalem now, trying to find love there. That's not gonna happen. So feeling really that ancestral rupture in some way. But yeah, so from my dad's side, my grandmother, she comes from a long lineage of being in the old city of Jerusalem for, I'm the 10th generation. And from my grandpa on my dad's side, he comes from Aleppo, from Khaleb. which I always loved that Aleppo, Jerusalem tradition, especially the musical traditions. My grandfather was a spiritual prayer leader. I get a lot of my devotion from him.
Beautiful, beautiful, like spiritual and
Yeah.
music traditions.
Yeah, and that has been, my source of prayer for most of my life. And then from my mom's side, my grandparents are Kurdish, and they were born in northern Iran. And yeah, and then, we have somewhere a great-grandmother from Baghdad and a great-grandfather from Shiraz. So we have like a lot of, like, I really feel like in some ways I'm a mix of this Middle Eastern region. And even just in my family, I feel, because there was different dynamics from my dad's side of the family and from my mom's side, and, all the like small dynamics and the different.
All of it,
exactly. But yeah, I think it was always really hard to reckon with. It's like, what does it mean to be Middle Easterner and Jewish and in Jerusalem? And yeah, like what is this identity? The truth is I grew up with a lot of shame around my identity, with this identity, Mizrahi identity, which, was coined with the establishment of the State of Israel, to refer and to basically lump all Middle Eastern Jews into one category. And Mizrahi means Eastern. So it's like always such a wild thing to be an Easterner in a Western state. You're just like, and this navigation of like, what is it to be an Easterner and now to be a Westerner, and this constant negotiation. But, like we also suffered in a lot of ways from being called barbaric and primitive and, that we're coming from places where there's no culture, no education, and no any of that.
We're lumped into the whole Arab thing, and the Arabs have been dehumanized.
Exactly. And, Mizrahim went through like such an intense process of what I've called Israelification, which is not so different from like American assimilation, right? Where we really had to lose our identity in order to fit in order to belong. And, psychologically, I think this need to belong is so strong for all of us humans. Like, we just want to belong, we just want to fit in, that sometimes we'll give up everything to just feel like connected to other humans. And, that's happened to so many different communities in so many different ways. So yeah, there's, been such an extreme loss. And I think in Mizrahi communities, sometimes we also talk about it generationally. My grandparents' generation, their Arab Mizrahi identity was so important to them because, they lived post-48, pre-48, and just the tradition and the music and the food and all of it, like they weren't going to give that up. The language, So that was kind of the first generation of Mizrahim. And then the second generation, my parents' generation, we call them the assimilated generation, where they kind of felt embarrassed and shame from their parents. And they wanted to, there's a Hebrew word called lehishtaknez, which means to become Ashkenazi, become, European Jewish. So that was a really, really strong force in a lot of Mizrahi homes. So, you see the parent generation really trying to assimilate, to become Israeli, to forget their roots, to, lose the Arabic tongue, which isn't just the Arabic language, but it's also the way of speaking Hebrew. We also speak with guttural sounds, and, we've lost that. And then, there's me, which we call the third generation of Mizrahim, who, grew up in this very complicated landscape, to say the least, right? But, I was very close to my grandparents, loved my grandparents deeply, and had one narrative for my grandparents, and then I had a whole different narrative for my parents. And it's, you're a child, you're trying to understand what's going on. And then, you go to school and you're confronted with the Ashkenazim, who have such a different experience, and then you see the Palestinians and they have a whole other experience, and then it's a lot of confusion. And actually I remember one time talking to a dear Palestinian friend from Jerusalem, and we were talking about how, especially when you're a child, like no one sits you down and is like, okay, here's what happened, here's how we got to here, here's all the different dynamics. Like you just grow up with so much confusion trying to somehow piece all these things together as you're trying to also develop yourself as a human, you know, which is almost an impossible ask. But I think because I was always had this dedication to God, or this, you know, you could call it this dedication to truth, I was always also a very curious person. Like, I didn't really like to just believe what people told me. And, you know, I was always also very interested in philosophy and in art and in questioning and in reading. And somehow that exposed me both to my own identity and to Palestinian identity and to Middle Eastern identity and, you know, all of these very big conversations. And, you know, I remember that one time I was in a Mizrahi activist organizing group. And we had like this visioning meeting not too long ago. I think it was like a year ago. And we were talking about different issues and how we show up to activism, which we focus on, which we put our attention. And we were talking about Mizrahi Palestinian solidarity. And I remember there was a Mizrahi elder there who, you know, has been a Mizrahi activist for a long time. And so he said to me something really powerful. And he said, I cannot show up for someone else's oppression if I don't even know who I am. Like, it's just not possible to even see someone else if I don't even know who I am. And this is what's happening with a lot of Mizrahim, I feel. There's a huge, huge identity loss, cultural loss, so much loss, that they don't even know internally who we are. And then, you know, something that I've been pushing for a long time is, right, what does that look like to have Mizrahi Palestinian solidarity? And it's really hard to do that without doing also this deep, like...
Yeah, of course, remembering of your own identity.
Exactly, remembrance work, ancestral work. Yeah. Why don't we speak Arabic anymore? Why is it seen as a terrorist language? You know, like, so many Jewish scholars were writing in Arabic. Are we just 100%. Not going to read them anymore, you know?
Yeah, that's so powerful.
Yeah.
You're a woman, a Jew, an Arab, and a spiritual mystic. Can you tell us more about what it was like to be at those intersections?
Yeah, you know, one of my healer tells me, I resist this a lot because it's a very uncomfortable place to be, but he's like, so much of your identity is about the in-between. You cannot just take one side unquestionably. Like, you're an in-between. And that is also in some ways the place of the mystic, right? Because the mystic, you know, I teach spirituality, and sometimes I say that, you know, we have our ordinary minds, which is basically our linear minds and how we perceive information in the ordinary landscape. And then we have our mystic mind. And the mystic mind is actually about being able to hold paradox and peace. Because the linear mind it gets very reactive when there's two contradictory truths. It can't handle it. But the mystic mind actually knows that holding paradox, that's part of the path to God. And we see this in scripture, you know, on all sorts of levels. Scripture is contradictory. And some secular people will say, like, oh, that's a proof that it's not, you know, true. But actually, on the contrary, it's a proof that it is the path. And, you know, I also grew up with a lot of integration of spirituality and science. My dad's a quantum physicist. So, you know, even quantum physics is like proving these deep spiritual truths that, you know, how can light be a particle and a wave? These are contradictory things, but somehow they're both true. So this understanding of mysticism, and really what I would say, it's the development of the mind, development of consciousness. And especially with Arab Jewish identity, you know, someone once told me that it very much is similar to like a queer identity, right? This in between. And it's something that I've actually noticed is that queer Arabs have a much easier time understanding Arab Jewish identity than non-queer Arabs.
Yeah, of course.
Because it's like, okay, we were put into this binary war of Arabs versus Jews, and that's just how we filter our understanding of what's happening. But what if we destabilize the Arab versus Jew dichotomy? What happens there? And in that way, I find that, you know, my identity is really powerful a very hard place to be, because you receive it from all angles.
Oh yeah, all of it. It's all coming at you.
Oh, it's all coming at me. Yeah. But I think that there's something powerful about being in that in-between, because the in-between can really challenge all of it.
Yeah, and that's where the work is.
Yeah.
I want to get into some context before going deeper into your healing journey.
Let's do it.
What does the date May 15th, 1948 mean to you?
I think it means a lot of heartbreak, a lot of tragedy, a lot of loss, a lot of separation, a lot of misguided dreams, a lot of confusion, whether it's, of all sides, I'm thinking about Ashkenazi Jews who were, trying to find safety, and here was this Zionist plan that provided them that. I think about Arab Jews who had no idea what was going on in Europe until very late into the 40s, and all of a sudden there was all this intense, attacks on Jewish community, and they were confused as to why, thinking about Baghdad, of Jewish community being there for 2,000 years, and all of a sudden feeling like the rug is pulled under you and not really sure why, and having to make a choice. Do I stay? Do I leave? Thinking about Palestinians who, were displaced and to so many different other lands, whether it's through the Middle East or in Europe or, wherever direction they fled. And really just this separation, the segregation of a whole region. There's a scholar, Avi Shlem, who's an Arab Jew scholar, who he says that, it wasn't just this physical segregation and separation that happened, but it was also a historical one. We stopped understanding our own history. Oof. And we started adopting these narratives that are historically inaccurate about our own communities.
Absolutely.
And I see that both with Jews and with Palestinians and with Arab Muslims and with everyone in the region. All of a sudden, it's like, this is an eternal war between Jews and Muslims, And we forgot that just a few generations ago, we were having Shabbat picnics in Aleppo, or celebrating Ramadan together, or...
Not even a few generations ago, literally just a few decades ago.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so it's really intense. And I think about this thing a lot, where this is the first time in history that Jews are not integrated into Muslim community. That's insane for me to really process. Yeah. And there you can get into, right, a political intellectual analysis around Christianity or Western Christianity, right, choosing to uproot Jewish community and fracture this relationship between Jews and Muslims, which you can see, as happened in Algeria, the separation between the Jews and the Muslims by giving the Algerian Jews citizenship and not giving Muslim Algerian citizenship, and how that created tensions between them. There's countless stories of this that, in some ways is a engineering of colonialism to really separate from Jewish and Muslim communities. And I think especially for Arab Jews, it's we are put in such an extreme situation where it's just okay, now we're fighting against Muslims, but Muslims are our family. So, there was one Mizrahi activist who said this joke where she's just also growing up in Israeli society. She's there's a moment where you realize the people who are, the government's telling you is your enemy, they look a lot like your grandmother. And then you're just confused because you're is my grandma my enemy? And just this tension that is there. Yeah.
So much there. What is Zionism and how did it start?
Oh, these are definition questions.
Just so people can understand,
totally.
I feel we need to talk about, and I think that's one of the issues today is we need to talk about context. We
Yeah.
can't look at things in a vacuum.
Totally. Yeah. So first I'll say that I think you're totally right. We need the context, we need the definitions. And I think that there's also this level of, there's an intellectual political analysis of what's happening. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I feel like it's not even relevant because so much of what's happening is people's emotional response and trauma.
Yeah.
So even if they hear the definitions, it's not necessarily going to shift anything.
They're just all in trauma response.
Exactly, which we'll get to, I'm sure.
Yes, you will.
But, Zionism, and that's part of why I'm also saying that in terms of defining Zionism, because, you can define Zionism as a secular political ideology that came from Europe that was very much modeled over the nation states model in Europe, right? And then brought over into the Middle East through Palestine, of the colonization of Palestine and of, also part of, this Western interest of having a state, a Western state, right? Zionism, in some ways, the dream of Zionism was to create Europe in the Middle East. And to, in some ways, also, of course, Palestinians suffered the most from the consequences of Zionism. And it was Zionism, also in some ways was waging a war on the whole Middle East. Yeah. Which we see from Arab Jews as well, but not just, but right, everything that was seen as Easterner was devalued and dehumanized, and it was kind of like
othered.
And othered. It was like either you get with us or you are gonna die or gonna flee. Mm-hmm. And even if you get with us, you're never actually gonna be safe here. So it's very, very harsh. I think it's also really, wow, how do I say all these things? The thing with Zionism is that, okay, so we have this definition of this political, secular ideology of creation of nation states through colonization. And also, very much using the Holocaust trauma because when Zionism first started, actually many Jews didn't support it. Both in Europe and in the Middle East, they didn't really see the point of that. But actually, Zionism only became popularized in the Jewish community after there was massive trauma, both the Holocaust, but also, all the different attacks on Jews in the Middle East. And then what you see is that people started clinging on to Zionism because they felt they didn't have safety anymore. And Zionism provided an answer for Jewish safety. Not a very good one, but it was an answer in a moment where there was no answer. So Jewish community, all kind of clung to it. And I think also because I think something that we sometimes take for granted, the 1940s were such a politically destabilizing time in the world. People weren't really making the average human, I'm not talking about people who were like leading the movements, who were signing the deals, but the average people, they weren't consciously thinking, okay, now let's do the pros and cons table. They were fleeing for their lives. All of a sudden things were happening. I think about Arab Jews and I think about what would I have done, in that moment where all of a sudden I'm getting news of what just happened to Jews in Europe. And then all of a sudden I saw Nazi propaganda coming in to whatever Arab country I was in, and then seeing, Arab Muslims betray us. Like, I don't know what I would have done in that moment. So yeah, and I think that there's also something to be said about what is called religious Zionism, which really only started later. Sometimes it's kind of misunderstood, this thing that a lot of Mizrahim, the reason why they chose to come onto the Zionist project was for actually religious reasons, not political ones, as opposed to, more of the Ashkenazi European Zionism, which was coming much more from a political lens. The Mizrahi lens was much more coming from a religious place. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think one of the things that I think is also important to name, is in this conversation and this question of like, how do we dismantle Zionism? How do we fight for Palestinian liberation? How do we, heal all these injustices that have occurred? For me, this understanding that Zionism was really popularized through Jewish trauma and continues to this day, right? The way that it functions is through feeding off of Jewish pain and Jewish trauma, which is very, very real. And yeah, I think that it's sometimes challenging for me because, as someone who cares very deeply for both Jews and Palestinians, it's a very uncomfortable place to be in, where I want to care for Jewish people and I want to care for Palestinian people, and I want, the apartheid system to end. I want the occupation to end. I want the siege to end. I want all of these things to end. I want Palestinians to have freedom, right of return, all of that. And I also want there to be a reckoning with anti-Semitism in a real way, not in a way that's, silencing Palestinians, because that's, of course, ridiculous. Of course. But just like, what does actually Jewish safety mean and what does that look like? And my personal position is that if we don't have an answer to that question, we're not going to be able to dismantle Zionism as much as we try, because Zionism is giving an answer to this question. And unless your position is, I don't care for Jewish safety, all Jews can die, which, is of course anti-Semitic, which some people hold, then we do have to reckon with this question. And, I think that all Palestinian scholars were reckoning, reading Edward Said, it's like, it's so interesting. It's like some of me and my Palestinian friends joke sometimes that, like, if Edward Said was alive today, he would be completely canceled. So I think that we can't really leave aside Jewish trauma and anti-Semitism outside of the conversation. This is part of the conversation. And I'll say something that maybe perhaps is a bit edgy also. You can choose to include it or not. But, I think that Palestinian trauma is just so similar to Jewish trauma. And if you're looking at it from a somatic and spiritual perspective, of course it makes sense, because in some ways there was a transference of trauma. Mm-hmm. All the trauma that Jews were carrying was transferred onto Palestinian trauma, right? So exile, displacement, massacre, like all of these things. I mean, even Gaza, which you can think of as a concentration camp, like all of these different ways, there's clearly a transference of trauma that's happening. And, sometimes in the discourse, I find it that there is this like blaming Jews narrative, that it's like, why didn't the Jews heal their trauma? How dare they like now, move that trauma onto Palestinians? And I can understand where that comes from. And because I hold a spiritual and energetic lens, it's not like, oh, Jewish trauma and then Palestinian trauma. It's just trauma that's moving through different people. Mm-hmm. There's nothing unique about Jewish people that's making them oppressors in the state of Israel. And there's nothing unique about Palestinians that making them it's just, these are cycles of human suffering and oppression, right? Any group of people that survives a genocide is an insane amount of pain. Yeah. And if we don't hold the pain, and if we don't, we understand this very well from a personal perspective, right? If I grew up in a abusive home, exactly. It's like, and if I don't do my trauma work and heal that, then of course I'm going to enter a relationship when some of those patterns are going to be.
And I'm going to pass it on to my kids. And
exactly. So that's what's happening on a personal level. So we can imagine that happening on a collective level. Which is why I don't like this game sometimes that it's about identities and like, oh, the Jews and the Palestinians and the this and the that, because for me, I see that it's an energy that we need to process, that we need to heal. Mm. And I think that's also why, everyone in the world is actually affected by this. It's not just...
Oh, absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, the other day when I heard, that land is the heart's, the world's heart chakra, I'm like, it is. Everybody's feeling it.
Yeah.
There's no one that isn't feeling what's happening there.
Yeah, and that is also where I hold the spiritual lens as well, as Jerusalem being the channel of God, the prophetic lineage channel. And it's like, so much of my work started out by talking about how Jerusalem is in exile, and this understanding of Jerusalem herself being in exile, and what does that mean for a city of God to be in exile? Because a city of God is supposed to be a heaven of multi-religious prayer and care and community. And Jerusalem today is a racially segregated apartheid city. That is, you could say that is a sin against God, right? Like that we are. So as a woman of faith, it's like, of course, I'm going to care for the light of Jerusalem, which to me can only be really revealed through a multi-religious understanding, where, people of all religions have access to the holy sites, all the prophetic lineages are honored. It's sometimes you feel like you're a bit mad, and I'm sure you feel this all the time, where especially where you are thinking about the levels of extreme oppression that Palestinians are made to go through, and it just at some point feels so insane that it's just like, these walls and the segregation and the checkpoints, and it's like, how could this be the Holy Land? Sometimes back home we call it the Hell Land. Because we're like, it's not holy, it's hell.
Oh my God.
Because the level of trauma is just so severe, so intense, and it keeps being reenacted, and it's just a bubble of just pain and trauma vortex and pain and trauma vortex, and it's really hard to get out of that.
It is. Yeah. You talk about being an anti-Zionist Jew. What does that mean?
Okay, it means a couple of things. One is to be rooted in a devotional Judaism for me, which I personally believe that militarization and devotion do not go hand in hand. We see that in our scripture, even with King David, who, he killed people as part of, some divine war. But because he had blood on his hands, he wasn't allowed to build God's temple. And his son, Solomon, King Solomon, had to do it, which, means peace. Mm-hmm. And I really hold that to be true, that if you have blood on your hands, you cannot really enter God's temple. Mm-hmm. And for me, I desire to enter God's temple. So I cannot really support militarization as a form of safety. Because I also intellectually know, just like here in the US, right? Sometimes there's this narrative of, oh, we need more policing to keep us safe. Mm-hmm. But evidence shows that more policing actually just creates more crime.
Yeah, of course.
Because it's a cycle. So I see that also with Zionism, right? That it's like Jewish people are wanting safety, and then they're like, okay, let's cling to this army, let's cling to these barriers of protection and walls, and just really going to really, really extreme levels. And, I see all the fear that is there. It's really like so rooted in so much existential fear of being annihilated, of being wiped out. But for me, right, the answer to fear is not walls. Also, as a spiritual person, I cannot really take that seriously, right? Because fear, right, in Judaism, we have this teaching about that there's two ways to serve God, right? There's a path of fear and there's a path of love. Mm. And the path of love, right, is the one that I choose. Because the path of fear, right, while fear, there's many reasons why to feel it, and I think I'm pretty unique in some ways, sometimes in my community, because I'm not trying to negate Jewish feelings at all. Like, I think it's very real, the fear and the grief and all of it. And I personally don't believe that the cycle of militarization and colonialism is what's going to keep us safe. And I think as we're seeing that, through how it's all playing out, it's not keeping us safe.
Yeah.
And it's also creating a lot more misunderstanding of who Jews are in the world, and it's making people see that trivialize our pain, or think that we're making it up because it's like, how can these people be a victim if they have one of the most powerful armies in the world, right? So there's a lot of kind of those narratives that then are built
that don't serve you,
that don't serve us. Yeah. So yeah, and of course, it comes from being an anti-Zionist Jew, is also seeing that like Jewish liberation and Palestinian liberation is intertwined. And, I don't say that as like this nice thing that it's like, oh, collective liberation, all of our fate is bound up together. But whether we like it or not, and I know a lot of people don't like it and a lot of people resist it, but this is what the universe has brought us to. It's like either we choose to somehow put our weapons down, put our defenses down. Like, really, the cycles of like attack, defense, it's like, I get tired just talking about it. I don't know how people are not exhausted from, trying to uphold that. So I think we really need to understand that we're both people of this land, and the only way is to see our shared humanity, our shared narratives, our shared lineages, really. And I think that's also, it's sometimes it's frustrating because I'm very much in Jewish community and in Palestinian community, and sometimes hearing the different narratives, of all spectrums, it's like, I don't really understand what sort of vision people have if it's not Jewish-Palestinian solidarity. I really don't get it. Like for me, if you don't really come into that place of Jewish-Palestinian solidarity, then you're either saying that all Palestinians should die or that all Jews should die.
Like, you're making me quite emotional. It's true.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
I mean, yeah, I'm curious what's coming up for you around that.
I mean, it's true. I think you're speaking truth. It's absolutely 100%. There's no liberation if it's not collective.
Yeah. And also, I'll say something higher around that because, there's a political reality, and political, especially in the Middle Eastern context, right? We have been so divided. I mean, not even if you just look at Palestine, you look at the whole region, the way that every indigenous group, every tribe is like, every faith group is just, there's so much division and segregation, and these people don't belong and these people don't belong. And that is, in my perspective, I like to understand what's happening in Palestine from a regional perspective, not just as independent, but to really understand that, okay, what's happening around here? And we really are seeing such a fierce division of all level. Sometimes even if it's like in your own family or your own community, like none of us can agree on anything. And none of us, like, we feel so isolated and upset when someone says one word that we don't like. And I really believe that from a spiritual perspective, we are being called to unify our hearts, and to really let go of the divisions that really start from the mind, right? Why does a mind create division? Because it's in pain, right? There's some pain that's unprocessed. So the mind likes to cling on to a narrative that helps it feel protected in that, and then it projects it into the external world. And because the internal suffering isn't digested, it actually then creates more external suffering. And I think that, on my good days, I like to think that we are really blessed, actually, because, sometimes when I am in Jerusalem and then I leave and I go to Europe or I go to Florida or wherever, and I'm like, wow, people can just live ordinary lives and like not have to face all of this deep trauma and oppression and like, what kind of life is that?
It feels surreal.
It's surreal. It's so surreal. But there's something so beautiful of being so deep in it. Like, we're really being called on a spiritual level, I believe, to really transform so much. Yeah. And I really believe that on this higher level, that our souls have chosen to do this work. Right? Because, we are here to reveal God's light, and we're here also to recover the spirituality of our lands. Yeah. I personally don't believe that we can shift the political reality without the spiritual reality. And this is where I've dedicated so much of my life to both studying spirituality and teaching spirituality, because what I found is that in the political landscape, it just ends up being a lot of ego and trauma and and
money, power, control, greed.
Exactly. and that's not something I can trust. So, and I believe that the spiritual traditions, right, this is where we find, the healing, but also this unifying field, right? If you ask Jerusalem as a city or as a land, what does she want? I don't think she's going to say, no Jews here, no Palestinians here. Like, no way, right? So I think that we need to also start this practice of what it means to listen to the land, what it means to listen to the spirituality of the land, what it means to let go of our narratives and our trauma and our ego in service of that which is greater than us. Yes. Because we do not know all the answers. And Yeah, I just really believe that we need to root ourselves in our souls to really heal what's happening.
Yeah.
I personally am in a place where I can see how anti-Semitism and anti-Palestinian rhetoric, is connected. But because it's also, in this place of like, oh, well, the Jews are oppressing the Palestinians. So sometimes people have a hard time seeing that. I think we actually have to contend with these very uncomfortable questions of like, why do Jews hang on to Zionism, and where does that anti-Semitism come from for them that they feel the need to hang on to Zionism? Like, and this is where I become like a kind of a controversial person, because I'm not going to reject my Jewish community for wanting safety and clinging on to Zionism for that. I'm not going to reject really anyone. I'm not going to reject Palestinians who choose armed resistance and then, who harm my family or my cousins. Like, I'm not going to reject those people either, because I understand the circumstances. And I think that's what it means to also be a spiritual person, is to get to a place where you're not actually rejecting anyone, because if you reject someone, what does that mean? Psychologically, it means that you're rejecting a part of yourself. Mm-hmm. And you're going to suffer probably in this life, because whenever we reject something in us, we suffer.
Yeah, it creates suffering.
Yeah, and I think that's very similar to dehumanization as well, right? When we dehumanize others, it's because we've already been dehumanizing ourselves. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where it's like we need to get the scissors and like cut the conversation. And this is also what I was saying before around, there's an intellectual analysis that is very pretty and very digestible, but it sometimes doesn't even feel relevant, because we're dealing with traumatized bodies. And, something that I've come to also is that I'm not going to judge anyone for being in extreme situations of pain and making choices that they're making based off that extreme choices of pain. Why? Because I don't know what I would do if I was in that situation. And that goes both for Palestinian and Jews and for everyone, like I don't have the knowledge of what I would do if I was faced with whatever, and I think that's where the humility, the compassion, these spiritual virtues are so important, because I find that sometimes in the narrative, it's like we have so much judgment, we have so much critique, we have so much righteousness. This is right, this is wrong, this is... And if we're living in a world of right and wrong, we are kind of limiting our understanding of the human condition.
Yeah, absolutely. My sister-in-law just yesterday was saying, she's Moroccan, and she was saying she wishes that the king of Morocco would just say, all Jews come back to Morocco and we'll give you citizenship and you'll be welcome here and all that stuff. And I'm like, that would be so good.
And, by the way, I have a lot of Moroccan Jewish friends who are moving from Israel, Palestine to Morocco.
Oh, they are.
Yeah, and one of my friends actually is getting citizenship there, and they're trying to start a Jewish art residency. So, like, amazing. That's happening.
I mean, that's what needs to happen, right?
Of course.
That's the work that needs to happen.
And right now, it's mostly only happening in Morocco and maybe Tunisia a bit, and other... this is where I sometimes get frustrated, because sometimes when I talk about Arab Jewish identity, the response is like, oh, great, go to Morocco. And I'm like, Morocco's not my lineage. Like, it's actually very different from my lineage, My lineage is Syria, Palestine, So I don't know. I think that I think one of the things that I realize is that it's very easy to criticize a community that's not yours, and it's very hard to criticize your own community. And I think that the part of the way that we get through this is to, as my friend was saying, is like taking radical responsibility for our part. And I'm willing to personally do that. And I hope others...
I'm doing it.
Yeah, here exactly. Here we are. We're two. We're starting here. You know what I mean? Because we can't keep just, playing these games. Because what does that give us?
Nothing. Everybody loses.
Everybody loses, and then it solidifies this attack defense, because if I don't feel like there's space for my pain, I'm going to be on the defense. And if you don't feel like there's space for your pain, you're going to be in the defense, and then we're going to be in attack defense mode, when really we need to connect our hearts and shared pain and shared grief. We're not going to get through this until we're radically honest about everything, really everything. And it's going to be gruesome, because the reality is brutal. And this is where we have the spiritual eyes, because our physical eyes, and I see this a lot, our physical eyes cannot comprehend this level of horror. We're not meant for that. So this is where it becomes really important to not, when I'm looking at this reality, I'm not looking at it as like a Hadar. I'm looking at it as Hadar who is aligned with a divine source. And all of a sudden I have much greater power and perspective of what is happening here, And also this understanding that personal Hadar actually doesn't know much. I'm here for like 120 years max, like in this grand scheme of human evolution, of life, like that's such a tiny part in the ocean of God. So that's that for me, that's like the constant humbling, the constant surrender, the constant like, what's the pathway to connect to other people's hearts? That's what I'm looking for, and I think that's what needs to happen. And it's hard because we have so many defenses around our hearts. Reasonably so, because there's a lot of pain. And one of my beliefs is that God is the most merciful, compassionate one. So if God is the most merciful, compassionate one, and God is infinite, there is space for all the pain. We don't have to be selective about pain.
Yeah. What's the connection between anti-Semitism, colonialism, and the global North's domination?
Okay, so anti-Semitism sometimes is said as like one of the oldest forms of systemic oppression. Why? Because it started around, the Roman Empire and really was attached to empire building. So actually you could say that, the origination of empire comes from a very, very anti-Semitic place. And part of that, as we see, especially in the beginning with the Roman Empire, was this idea of using Jews as a middleman, right? That we're not fully going to oppress the Jews all the way, but we're going to give them some level of power and privilege so that other marginalized folks hate the Jews too. And then we can blame all of our empire violence on the Jews. So a practical example of how that happened, this is where a lot of the association of Jews and money comes from, was through Jews being tax collectors in the Roman Empire, right? So, if you were a poor person and a Jewish person is coming knocking on your door to collect the tax and take the tax from you, you're going to start associating, right? Oh, these people who are taking tax from me are these Jewish people. And you're going to start, but they were, Jewish people were placed there strategically so that the face of oppression can be Jews. And then, the behind the scenes won't be seen, which is not so dissimilar than actually what's happening in Israel right now with, global powers and all of that. So this understanding that Jews are the middleman is something that developed over time. And, we see that in so many different forms, right? So this is where, anti-Semitism can sometimes look different than other forms of oppression because Jews are actually allowed to have power. That doesn't mean that there isn't anti-Semitism, right? And we see this historically, right? And in Spain and Germany, anytime there was, a big atrocity against the Jewish community, it's not that Jews were all poor. Some of them were in high positions of power. They were still murdered for being Jewish. So Jews having power doesn't mean that there isn't anti-Semitism. And I think especially in the American left, there's a lot of confusion around it because people are like, oh, well, see, Jews are in government, Jews are this, or they're fine. And there's not really an understanding of no, that's actually how the cycle of anti-Semitism happens. And I think that the way that you see that, right, with Zionism, like I was looking at statistics, the Christian Zionist organization, QFI in the US, has 15 million members, which is like almost as many Jews in the world as there are. And the biggest funders of Zionism are actually Christian Zionists. Yeah. And we don't talk about that. We just talk about Jewish people and Jewish. Why? Because the image of Israel and the image of apartheid are Jews. And that's not to dismiss Jewish responsibility in that, right? And especially we see that, of course, Palestinians in the West Bank, right? They're seeing settlers, they're seeing people who are Jewish, and they're just like, wow, these Jews, how could they be doing these horrifying things? But when we're looking at the system, and even as we're looking, right, the Western interest of having Israel as a state is to have an imperialistic interest in the Middle East. So that's not really at all about Jewish safety. It's actually, again, about using Jews as a middleman, right? It's like, and this is very much what Christian Zionism believes, right? We're going to use Jews Jews will go to Palestine, and then eventually we'll kill them all, right? That's the plan. So that's where it also feels really uncomfortable for me, where, when we don't have this critical lens of anti-Semitism. And again, that's not to deny that, right, Israel is an openly Jewish state and that there's Jewish supremacy, and that's part of how that happens. But it's also to kind of zoom out and, as you said, like looking at the global North interests that are largely not about the protection of the Jewish people. They're actually more about, right, the military industrial complex and wealth and capitalism and all of these power. And there's a way that Jewish people are being used. And I think that this is one of my biggest heartbreaks, especially right now, is to just see, especially with Mizrahi community, it's just like we've been so used. And, Mizrahim, we know this. We've been used by Ashkenazi Jews. We've been used by Arab Muslims. We've been used by almost everyone. And no one even cares to hear our story authentically being told. And we don't really have that much power. Mizrahim, like, we barely have anything left, really. So it's just, and sometimes this is a question that I have also with the Palestinian movement and to free Palestine and for the Arab world and all of this stuff. It's like, are people really okay with just Arab Jewish history being completely lost and forgotten? Which I've had a lot of Arab Muslims say to me. It's like, we actually didn't think about it. Because, right, like
Zionism casts such a big shadow that I think so many people don't even think about the Arab Jews anymore.
Yeah, and Ella Shohat, who's one of our Mizrahi scholars, Arab Jewish scholar, she wrote a book about Arab Jews in Palestine and in the 80s, right? And she was like one of our big political revolutionaries. But she talks about something that I find really brilliant, and I really see, where she's just like, Zionism, Arab nationalism, all this rise of nationalistic discourse. What did it do? It created Puritan identities, meaning that just as Zionist now equals Jewish, right? There's been a solidified identity. There was actually a parallel identity equation that happened in which Arab equals Muslim. So for me, it's a bit hard to question Zionism equals Judaism if you're not also questioning Arab equals Muslim. It's actually also spiritually, I have a thing called God Fellowship, which I have my own curriculum that I've developed about the path towards God. And one of the things, this also comes from a scientific perspective, that for every action, there's a reaction. Nothing exists as just one thing. If I press on this table, the table's pressing back up on me. I don't think it's intellectually honest to just keep blaming Zionism and Israel for the problem of the whole Middle East without looking at what was the reaction, because they're bound up together. So just as we have to dismantle Zionist equals Jewish, we also have to dismantle Arab equals Muslim. 100%. These are actually the same thing.
100%.
And this is where I think that radical responsibility comes in, right? Where it's just like, you can't really expect people to be doing the work without you also doing the work.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I grew up in Lebanon and with so many different religions, right? So for me, I thought that was what, Arabs were multi-faith.
Yeah, and we are.
And we are. So it's actually just kind of a foreign concept that you cannot be multi-faith, that you cannot be living with so many different faiths in one place, because that's how it is. All my friends are from different faiths. That's just how it works,
I love that. Yeah, and sadly, when you look at most Arab organizations, they're not really thinking about that. They conflate Arab and Muslim all the time. They don't think about diversity of religion. They don't think of diversity of even indigenous groups, like what's happening to Kurdish people, what's happening to Armenians, Assyrians, and we need to talk about that.
100%, yeah. Ain't that the truth? So I just want to ask you one small question on something you brought up. You mentioned Christian Zionism and how that plays into this whole thing. Can you just explain that a little bit more? Where do you think Christian Zionism comes from, and what does it play into?
Yeah, so there's different lineages of Christian Zionism, different perspectives, but basically, right, it comes from an evangelical perspective around the Messianic days, or right, the rupture where Jesus will return back, and that can only happen when the Jews are back in the Holy Land, and then basically there'll be this moment, right, where either the Jews convert to Christianity or they die. And that's, part of like the messianic belief of evangelical Christian Zionism, which again, we see kind of, right, this using of the Jews, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Jews will be the middleman. They will, take the Holy Land, they'll oppress Palestinians, and everyone will blame the Jews for it. And then when it's our time to shine, we'll go there and we'll take over everything. So that's part of the belief, the Christian agenda of colonialism and imperialism is just, that's how so much of it happened. And not just in the Middle East, also looking in Latin America and like the erasure of indigenous spiritual communities, and then everyone's converting into Christianity, and in Africa, in all places in the world.
It seems like when we talk about the war of religion, it's always like Muslim and Jews, and I feel Christianity just kind of disappears, like as if it's not really playing a role. What's the role of Christianity in this, this religious war we see?
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly the role, is to wedge between Jews and Muslims, so that Jews and Muslims fight each other, and nobody thinks about, the Christian empire that's behind the scenes. That the Muslims blame Jews, and that the Jews blame Muslims, which sadly we're seeing, right? Like that, right, there's different theories about how anti-Semitism then got imported into the Middle East, and then through Zionism, Jewish community became very Islamophobic, and like this division that now like Jews are carrying Islamophobia and Muslims are carrying anti-Semitism, and we're just like fighting each other, and we're not living together in the same ways that we used to be. So we're not even interacting unless we seek it out, and then we have to, before we even connect, first we have to have like a list of questions to make sure we feel safe, and like take down this whole wall that's been created. So it's quite intense.
How is this serving Christianity?
I think it's a way in which, and I think we see this in the U.S. very clearly, especially on the left, when people think about systems of oppression, very rarely they talk about Christian hegemony, right? Very rarely they talk about Christian dominance. That's not seen as like a system of oppression, as some other forms of oppression are seen. And it is this way where it's just like, okay, it's a bit, right, invisibilized under the ground, so that we don't really understand that that's happening. And then, a lot of that is where the anti-Semitism also comes from, where it's just like, oh, okay, because that is so hidden, then what is seen in the public is, oh, the Jews are evil, the Jews are the devil, the Jews are the colonizers, the oppressors, and
the Arabs are the barbaric, they're the terrorists,
exactly.
And these narratives just keep on perpetuating themselves.
It's been so confusing to sit with, like, how the world can be so deeply anti-Palestinian and anti-Semitic and Islamophobic at the same time. And somehow we're like fighting each other. And everyone else who's not directly impacted or involved has no idea what's going on, and like how to. So it's quite intense how this whole system was set up. And sometimes I'm like, how did we get here? How? And where's that stop button again, right? That we remember, as you said, right? Remember who we are. Remember our lineages. Remember where we come from. Remember our lands. Remember who we were before this last 100 years.
Yeah, how true. So I want to get into Jewish-Palestinian solidarity a little bit.
Okay, great.
Many people seem to be surprised when I mention Arab Jews, and often don't believe me when I say we had vibrant Arab Jewish communities. Why?
Well, one is because I think there is that conditioned narrative that's very much Arabs are Muslims and Jews are Ashkenazi. Jews survived the Holocaust, and Arabs, survived the Nakba and are fighting for Palestinian return, and this is just the situation. In the Arab Jewish community, we talk a lot about how it's like we're caught between these two atrocities, like the Holocaust and the Nakba, and that's what everyone around us is constantly talking about, the Holocaust and Nakba, the Holocaust and Nakba. And we are kind of ping-ponging because neither of them is exactly our story, but we're also part of both stories.
Yeah.
So it's, again, this in-between space where it's like, how do we show up for the responsibility of our part in it? But also, how do we have our own story? Like, we also have our own story that, wants to be heard.
Yeah.
And there's very little space for that because people, as you said, don't even think we are real, which is also sometimes mind-boggling to me because I don't really understand how, I
don't either, by the way. I'm just like, just that it's so black and white is just mind-boggling to me.
On all sides is already, especially if you grew up in the Middle East, it's just like you don't know much about the other side. And then you just make up fantasy stories about them. That's kind of what's happening right now. It's like, we don't know and we don't want to talk to them. So we'll just make up whatever you want in our heads. I've had people say such wild things to me and I'm like, where did you get that information? But then I understand, right? If you grow up in an Arab country with no Jews around you and all you see is what Israel's doing to Palestinians, then you make up really horrible things. But there is this question for me that I'm always like, how can you grow up in an Arab country and see, sometimes in Egypt or in Syria, it's like, the Jewish quarters are still there. Some of the synagogues are still there.
Yeah. In Lebanon too.
In Lebanon too, of course. Yeah, and I'm like, how can people walk past that and not ask questions? And I think, now in Egypt, people are more asking questions or just like, what happened to the Jews? Where are the Jews? But this is a very challenging thing to question, especially in Arab community because people think I'm lying, right? People are constantly, right? And this is where I feel the ancestral pain, right? Because my ancestors had to prove so much that they weren't Zionist in order to be approved as being Arab. And I find that I have to do that too all the time, even though I'm publicly anti-Zionist, even though I'm like fighting for Palestinian liberation. There's still people who will be like, Hadar is a secret propaganda, whatever. And it's like, how can you be fed such rhetoric to not question what the Arab government interest is? And this is really where I get confused because it's like, Arab governments have been abandoning Palestinians for decades, like, how can you take what Arab governments are saying at face value? Like, how can you not investigate that in a serious way? So, yeah, these are questions that I hold, but at the same time, it's, there's enough people. Thank God, this is one of the things that I really appreciate about Arabs in general. Like, I really, like, Arabs to me are like some of the smartest people I've ever met. If they really challenge the state propaganda, the government narratives, all of these different things, which there are people who, and like...
I grew up that way in Lebanon because it's such a multi-faith country. Like, we literally, like, everything is debated.
Yeah.
Everything's a debate.
And it's beautiful.
And I don't have to agree with you.
Right.
I could still love you and you could be my best friend, but we just challenge everything. We debate everything.
Yeah, and it sharpens the mind. And I think that there's such and that's also one of the tragedies for me because, so much of the brilliance of the world came from our region. Everything.
The list is long.
Yeah, and of course the spiritual traditions, but also math and algebra and geometry and poetry and
Arabic numerals. Hello.
Yeah, and I still think that's in our DNA. Like, we're very, very smart people. We're very smart people, and I think that's where I have this craving, this desire. It's like, oh my God, I want this like golden age society again.
We'll start at Hadar.
Yeah, where we could do the math and the spirituality and the healing and all of it together, and we don't have to be caught in these narratives that are just like, feel like, sometimes when someone talks, whether it's like from, you just feel like they're robotic, you already know what they're going to say before they're going to say it. They're saying the same points over and over again.
The gaslighting is the same.
It's like, yeah, it's like the same thing. It's like a rule book. And you're like, where is your mind? Like, it's, it's so hard to find.
This information and you've never questioned it.
Yeah, exactly. Oh. And the fear is so strong to even like question it a tiny bit. And
yeah. I read that it's impossible to teach about Arab art history, intellectualism, and culture while leaving out the ways Jews are fundamental to its creation. From Habiba Mesika to Yaqub Sanu to Halim Halali, Jews were integrated into Arab life. Even the legendary Fairuz that we all know adopted her name and was inspired by the Jewish Syrian singer Rachel Samosha, known as Fairuz al-Halabiyya. In what big and small ways can the Arab world remember and celebrate its rich Jewish communities?
Wow, that's beautiful. Also impressive. All these figures that you know, I'm impressed. 'Cause, yeah, most people have forgotten these names.
Again, remembrance, right?
Remembrance. Kulthum's teacher was also Jewish.
Yes.
Especially the singers. Wow, the Jewish singers of the Arab world.
I think all the traditions of like singing and they're just so intertwined in the different religions. You almost can't separate them,
Yeah, I mean, and also our faith and our language. I mean, all of it. Yeah, it's a beautiful question. I mean, first, I really believe that if you're a Middle Eastern organization of any kind and you don't have any Jewish people that you're either in conversation with or you're working with or, Arab Jewish people, you're kind of not doing your job. And I know it's a pretty intense thing to say, but, whether it's an art organization or a history thing, it's like you just can't keep on leaving out our narratives. And I understand, right, the fear of normalization or, oh, now they're all Zionists or all of these different things. These are things that we need to work through, not just say them and then go home, right? We need to recover our region, right?
Yeah.
And that's going to take conversations like this, right? This is going to take that. And which, thank God, that's actually how a lot of my work came about. Because I really, I would go to like an Arab bookshop and I would say, hey, do you have books about Arab Jews? And they would get all flustered and they'd be like, oh, let me look. And then, it'd put me to the Israel section. And I'm like, no, like before, is there something about, and usually there weren't. And then they realized, like, actually, that's not okay. And then they invited me to write, right? And I had a couple of those situations where that happened where, I would, not in an antagonizing way, but just question, like, hey, where are we? And then no one really ever asked them that. So they had to contend with that question. And, I think it's pretty easy once you start contending with that question, you realize, like, it's actually not okay to completely wipe out Jewish history in the Arab lands. And vice versa. I had actually organizations on the other side, which I think is really beautiful, right? Who came to me who were like, we've been researching indigenous communities in the Middle East, and we have a lot of data about many groups, but we don't have much about Arab Jews because of Zionism and normalization and all these things, and we want to break that. Do you want to join our team? So I had those things, and that was so beautiful and opening, and it's like, and then you sit down and you connect hearts, and you feel we're like the same pulse, the same curls, the same. And then sadly, I also had some rough moments also with organizations where just like we don't want to engage with that conversation because it's too terrifying. Which, I was definitely very hurt by in a lot of ways, but also on some level I understand because I understand how big this fear is. But yeah, I mean, I believe that, we just have to take responsibility. It's kind of like one of the things that I believe in, right? Because if we just start from where we are and we start building there, I feel like we're never going to get there because we're always going to be like, oh, here's going to be a stumbling block. Here's a whole grief vortex. Here's a rage spiral, right? We're going to be knocked by these things. And for me, what I've chosen is to be like, okay, pause. What is the vision that I have for these lands, for Jerusalem, for the region, what is the vision and how can I work backwards from there? Because once I have the vision clear, then the path starts forming itself. Oh, the vision is multi-faith. Okay, what do I need to do right now to help work to that vision, right? Because I think if we just start from where we are without like a clear vision in sight, we can get very lost in all the trauma vortexes. But once there's like a stronger vision, even if it feels like a fantasy and a million years away, like still some kind of guiding compass of like whether it's human rights values, faith, whatever it is, like something that feels like it aligns our center, then I feel like I can work kind of backwards from that. So that's what I've been choosing, and then you have to stay dedicated because there are going to be 101 million challenges on the way. Some that you can expect, some that you can't. But what else are we going to do? We're just going to let whatever's happening to continue happening the way that it is? We're just going to say it's too hard? Is that really what our souls have chosen? So, yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I've heard this. This was never a homeland for the Jews because Jews were always part of the Holy Land. So were Christians and Muslims, as we've talked about. As a 10th generation Jerusalemite, can you tell us a story from a time when Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived alongside each other in the Holy Land? Maybe even a time from your grandparents?
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh. Well, first of all, one of the things that's really beautiful, my great-grandmother from Aleppo, she had like 10 children. But we have a recorded book that I'm still kind of working on translating and all of that, of just, the different sayings at home, the different cultures, the different traditions. And yeah, I mean, and I think it's just so clear for me personally because, thank God, I grew up in a Mizrahi home that had a lot of devotion to spirituality and a lot of respect for Islam. And I remember actually when I was in LA, I was living with a Muslim housemate, and she was just like, you don't just, give space for Muslims, but I can actually see that there's reverence for Islam. And I'm like, yeah, that's how I grew up, and like my dad all the time would be like, oh, they're more devotional than us because they pray 5 times and we only pray 3 times, so just like this.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Comparing who's more devotional.
Totally. But there is this thing that, and I think Jews and Muslims, like theologically, we are aligned in the one God, and I don't know that there's any two religions that are more similar than Judaism and Islam. Some of our prayers are even almost word for word, and I think that's also the thing that's sometimes funny, that some of my Muslim friends will like learn something about Judaism and they'll be like, we have that too. And you're like, yeah, of course you do. Right. But, I think that I remember a story my grandma told me. This was like in the 30s. She grew up in the old city, and she's like, every day after school, we went to our neighbor's house. She had her Palestinian Muslim friend, and they would just play. This is kind of a sad story. I'm sorry, but this is already the 30s, and every day they just like played, and they had dessert, and they were kids. And this was when my grandma was 10. She was like, one day I went over, and the mom was like, you can't play anymore together. Because obviously things were shifting and the land and everything. But there was kind of, and I just remember my grandma's face as she said that. It like really hit me, because I feel like I also kind of grew up in that way. Especially I remember being a 10-year-old in Jerusalem and growing up and being like, wait, why can't I play with like Palestinian Muslims? Like, why can't we have like and just like that rupture of just like, of course, it's the most obvious thing. After school, you just go and play together and you eat together and you have fun. And then all of a sudden being like, actually, that's not allowed anymore. It's like so harsh. But, my grandma passed away a couple of years ago, but she always had Palestinian friends. And she never let that go. And I think that's also where, I in some ways grew up in this unique place, because I saw from my grandmother that, she didn't hate Palestinians. And also that there was that devotion and understanding of Islam. And I think, it's like sometimes there's kind of this evolution in Mizrach, right? There's sometimes like Mizrahi identity, and then there's an Arab Jewish identity. And then sometimes people talk about us as Islamic Jews. And the academics sometimes talk about Arab Jews as Islamic Jews, because part of the perspective of that is that it's really impossible to understand my Judaism without understanding Islam. Like, it's just impossible. And I actually think it's vice versa. Oh. So it's like, for me to actually understand my faith, I need to understand Islam. And I hope that, this is part of why I studied the Quran. Like, me and a Palestinian Muslim friend, like, we study scripture together and we chant, and also in the feminine voice. And it's to me, so sacred, and it's so beautiful, and it's so healing.
Oh, that almost brings me to tears.
Yeah, yeah. So and again, it's like the one God. We come to the one God, and we're cousins, or however they want to say it, but we are family. And I think that if we don't have this understanding, this is something that I feel very viscerally in my bones, that it ends up hurting us. Like, if I reject my connection to Muslims, I will be in pain, and vice versa. And I see this. I see this a lot with different Palestinian Muslims, Arab Muslims, Some of them like want to do Shabbat so badly, but then sometimes they get scared being around Jews, and this like inner conflict that I think a lot of us have, where it's like we want to reach out, but like, wait, is it politically safe? Like, how do we negotiate that? How do we navigate that? But I think that, we are gonna like be attracted towards each other, because I think underground, right, kind of like mycelium networks that are all connected that we can't see. That's also how I feel about our communities. We are just energetically connected. So we can choose to resist that connection and to say, no, the violence has been too intense. I don't forgive. I don't want to, Or we can choose to say, the longer that I hold on to that perspective, the more suffering I bring to the world, but also to myself. And I think that's, as you said, we're moving on to healing eventually. So like that also for me, how it came up into my healing narrative, because, I was born in Jerusalem, and then we moved to the US, and I personally moved out to California, which is where I started in different healing modalities. And I remember I was so angry. Like now, I look so composed. I still have a lot of anger in me, but like, I had so much rage in my system, just so much anger, really. And I didn't even know how to hold it. Like, I could feel it. It was burning me. It was actually burning me. And I didn't know how to let it go. And it was really scary, actually, because, I didn't know what to do with it. And I kept acting from that place of anger, of rage, and I would feel that every time I act from that place, what I'm doing is I'm hurting people that I love. This is actually when I had that realization, is that I realized that, and I think on a personal level, in some ways, we all go through that. Whatever families we grew up in, we all have some wounding, right? And then as you mature an adult, you realize, like, if I don't work on what is in me, I'm going to hurt people I love. And then at a certain moment, you wake up and you say, I don't want to hurt people I love. That's too much to take in. So I'm going to work on whatever is inside of me so that I can actually love the people that I love. That's a very hard task to do, because then
people don't want to face themselves. Right?
Exactly. And it's intense. And I think some of us don't even have the capacity, right? This is where we need massive healing support. We need trauma guides, experts. We need more resource than we have right now, because, for me, I feel very privileged. I was able to get, I met somewhere, so many healers along the road, so many healers gifted me sessions. Like, somehow I was able to do this healing and still embark in this path. But I got to a place where on the healing path enough that I realized that I really need to work on my own emotional reactivity, which I think is like the fabric of our region, right? We're all so emotionally reactive and explosive when we are challenged
Which is beautiful.
It's beautiful.
Because it makes us very like loving and emotive, but also very challenging.
Totally. It's really, really beautiful, and it's very challenging, and it's very hurtful sometimes, So I think that for me, it's been, okay, how do I orient this emotional charge? Where does it want to go? And sometimes in Judaism, we talk about Jerusalem as like the city of the fire. But I think a lot about that. It's like, okay, we're seeing so much destructive fire, but how do we shift it to creative fire?
Yeah. I think we're going to get into that. Jewish-Muslim solidarity runs deep. Many Arab Muslims have resisted targeted violence towards the Jewish community, for example, in Farhud, pre-1941 Baghdad. But that's the exact opposite of what we see in the media in the West or the global North. We are sold that this is a religious war. How can people of faith transcend that?
Wow, beautiful question. Last week I had dinner with a Palestinian Muslim friend, and, we were talking about all the things. And she said to me, she's like, if we are not friends, that means that Zionism wins. So, holding on to this friendship between us is part of the resistance. And I really believe that, really wholeheartedly, as hard as it may be, right? Because there's so much power imbalances and all this. But I think that, as you said, there is a very deep interest that sometimes we're aware of and sometimes we're not aware of that is really trying to pit us against each other. And we really have to refuse that. We have to completely refuse that. And we have to, understand that we can pray together, actually. I think that's the thing that is so beautiful. Even last week, it's a group of Muslim women, Arab Muslim, Palestinian Muslim, invited me as a Jewish person, as the only Jewish person on the call, to share a prayer with them, because there was a prayer circle. And I was so nervous because I'm like, oh gosh, what if I say the wrong thing and this person gets triggered because I said that? Because sometimes it's hard because it's so charged, and it's like, and especially, sometimes it's hard because I want to share Hebrew prayers, but some people have a reaction to Hebrew because of the way that they've, experienced that from the Israeli system. So I'm very sensitive to all these things. And it's also like I want to bring my Jewish faith. And yeah, it ended up being so, so beautiful. And I did share this prayer that our hearts are united together. And I could really feel that, through all this separation and segregation, it's like somehow our hearts are still united. Our hearts are still praying together, whether we know it or not. So we might as well just show up to the prayer together already. And then I'll say also that, I feel like I've been really blessed to have been invited into many Sufi spaces to lead Jewish mysticism alongside Sufi mystics. And I think that once you're on the spiritual path, you recognize the oneness of God. So, I like to say this is I think this is one of the highest spiritual teachings I've heard, right? But And I see this so much in the narrative, right? Because we all like to make an enemy in general in life. It's really easy to make an enemy and to blame it, right? Oh, it's because of this thing. It's because of that thing. But then, of course, when it comes to systems of oppression, it starts to feel justified. I'm blaming the system. I'm blaming this thing. And I start to create an enemy. This is the enemy, right? Zionism is the enemy. Hamas is the enemy. The West is the enemy. Right? There's so many levels of the enemy. And politically, on some level, it makes sense, right? There's receipts for why those things are the enemy. And the longer that I, in my consciousness, hold on to a narrative that there's an enemy, what I'm doing in practice is that I'm rejecting the oneness of God. Because how can I believe in the one God and believe that there's something separate from God? It's not possible. It's like we joke that, in Kabbalah, we call it the Sitra Achra, which is Aramaic for the other side. We don't call it Shaitan or Satan. We say the other side. But, the other side or Shaitan also work for God. They're not outside of God. They're actually in God's domain as well, right? And this is, the Kabbalistic practice that the other side is here to challenge us into greater awakening. Because without it, we will just sleep at home. So we need to be challenged to be on our spiritual path. And I think that this, the Sufi mystics, the Jewish mystics, all mystics on some level have this understanding that we cannot reject any part of reality. We cannot reject any part inside me, any part outside. This notion that there's an enemy is actually just a mental perception that actually creates a lot of fear. Now, that's not to say that there isn't physical harm and suffering. Of course there is. It's not a negation of that. But it is coming from this place, right? Spirituality, the bedrock of spirituality is understanding that I have an inner world and that the external world is actually shaped by my inner world. And if I want to change the external world, I actually have power to do that from the inside, not from the outside. And if I do it from the outside and not with the inside, I'm just going to be adding to more mess. So going inside, right, and there's different levels to that, but most importantly, I believe that's in consciousness work, which is examining the mental sphere, examining the thought patterns, examining how I'm still upholding the narrative, right? This is where we talk about, right, decolonization of the mind. If I'm still holding on to Arab versus Jews, oh, it's a religious war, but I'm not going to be able to really penetrate through all this noise. So we really have to examine how we are thinking. And again, you know, like I said before, I was like starting out with the vision and working backwards. I also believe that internally, it's like, what's the way that I want to be? Right? And spiritually, I don't know that there's a spiritual person on earth who would say, oh, through judgment, right? Judgment is just not the path for spirituality. It's compassion, it's humility, it's surrender, it's the mystery, it's the unknown. It's courage. It's courage to face yourself, courage to let go of yourself, right? These are the spiritual virtues. So, yeah, I feel, and this is where I feel really at home, especially in like Jewish Sufi practice, you know, like some of my most spiritual moments is like having Sufi Shabbat, or like one time we also organized a zikr on Hanukkah. It was so beautiful. We lit the Hanukkah, it was like on the 8th day too, so it was a full Hanukkah candles, and then we sat and we did zikr together, and it's like, the power that's there is so, so, so strong.
Yeah, I have goosebumps. Where does the need to have power over come from, especially in relation to the Palestine-Israel crisis?
Yeah, well, so, you know, I think that when you've been victimized, you develop this resistance to being a victim ever again, right? You don't want to be, right, this whole slogan, never again, never again, never again, right? On some level, never again means never again for anyone. But I think psychologically also a way that people hold it sometimes is like, never again will I be a victim. And this is where we see, right, the intense Israeli militarization coming from. Because if I can't afford to be a victim again, then I need to have a strong defense system. Because I cannot afford anymore to just be. And I think that resistance towards being a victim then creates this like power over. Because I don't want to be a victim anymore, then the only way in the world that I can survive is through, right, being an oppressor, being a dominator, and then making other people a victim. And then I'm at least not a victim. Now, of course, on some level, that's insane. And, you know, there's a Holocaust survivor who says, you know, someone asked him, he lost a lot of his family in the Holocaust, and someone asked him, well, that's, you know, one of the worst things that can ever happen to someone, right? And he says, actually, no, it would be worse to be the ones doing the killing. And, you know, I think that there's so much to unpack there about oppressed dynamics. But one thing I also want to offer around this question is a bit zoomed out also from a spiritual perspective. A lot of it comes from Kabbalistic teachings, right? But so when we're in the soul level, we are in the unity field, like the oneness, the one God. And this is where we come from. So we know it in our bones. But for the world to be created, there has to be some sort of separation, a separation from God. Because if we didn't have that separation, we wouldn't really have material reality, right? Just like when a baby is in the womb, they're first part of the mother, but then eventually they have to separate from the mother and they become their own person, right? So there's this aspect of separation, right? We start from this oneness and then somehow we get separated. And, you know, sometimes we could talk about it as like the fall from the Garden of Eden or all of this. But what happens when we have that separation, we have the notion of the world of duality, right? Because all of a sudden when there's something that's separate, there's two. So we go from being unity into being duality. This is where a lot of also non-dual teachings come from, that part of our spiritual purpose is to transcend this dual world and to get into that unity level again. This is, for me, also part of the belief in the one God. But it also is to recognize that the world is constantly pushing us into dual understandings of reality. This is part of the nature of our world. This is why there's so much polarization all the time.
The binary.
Exactly. And the binary, right? And the heart of it, the binary is actually the system of oppression, whether you can think about it as patriarchy, right, or whatever it is. Because whenever there's two, we know that we can't really have two and them being equal. Usually when there's two, there's a power difference. One is over and one is under. And then they're actually bound up together. So I can't actually support the power under unless I also understand what's happening for the power over, right? This is something that I've also developed for me personally in my justice analysis, that, sometimes people are like, we side with the oppressed no matter what. And I've developed to a place where it's like, no, I actually am trying to dismantle the system of oppression. Because, as we have seen with Palestine and with Jews, it's like, if I stand with the oppressed, well, oppressed can become oppressor. So what am I standing with, right? And also I think that we are plagued by victim consciousness on all level. And I think it's a lot with gender, right? Especially me as a woman. And I had to work through this so much, and I still am to this day, right? There's such victim consciousness around being a woman, and that victim consciousness keeps me disempowered when I actually don't need to hold on to that anymore. I'm not a victim, actually. But because I've been, in the system of oppression, James Baldwin has one of the most powerful quotes where he says, just because someone treats me like a victim doesn't mean I am a victim. Mm. And I think that's something that is really, really powerful, that it's like we can acknowledge that there's a system of oppression, but we do not take on this identification. Because once we take on this identification, what we do is we solidify the system itself. So, this is a bit of kind of, for me, that spiritual understanding of oppression and duality. But ultimately, right, the goal is to return to that unity field, to transcend the duality, to understand these power imbalances and understand the victim consciousness, understand the oppressor consciousness. Because if you really zoom out from a spiritual perspective, right, if you understand past life, if you understand karma, trauma, whatever all this is, it's like none of us are clearly one thing. Like, we're all in this human mess together. And I truly believe that every soul will either be an oppressed or oppressor at some point in their soul cycle, because this is part of our human development, right? Unfortunately, or for whatever reason, right? This is part of Earth school. And we can deny that, or we can start to learn how do we work with it. And I think this gender analysis really serves us well, right? Because in order for me to really dismantle patriarchy, I also need to understand how men are wounded by patriarchy. If I stand as a feminist and I keep on hating men and I say, they're the problem, they need to do this, they're not learned enough, go Google, what is that contributing?
Nothing.
And that took me a while. I'm not going to sit here and say that that's like something that I just had, I had a lot of anger and rage towards men for a long, long time. And there were periods in my life that I really didn't want to hang out with men because I was so traumatized. But, working through that, you get to a place where you're like, oh, I can really see men as whole beings. And yeah, I can still acknowledge that there's a power imbalance, but me seeing them as whole beings actually dismantles the system of oppression. And this is my belief. And I think that it's really challenging to apply that to Israel-Palestine because people are very caught in the oppressor-oppressed games. And I think that also the messiness of that reality, at this point, there's too many Palestinians who love Israelis and too many Israelis who love Palestinians. Like, we are mixed. There's relationships that are mixed. There are communities that are mixed. I'm part of these communities. And we can't just say it's one or the other. Like, we can't say that anymore. There's too many people who are caught in between, whether that's Palestinian 48ers or, that's people who come from mixed families. So we can't really make it so maybe intellectually it satisfies our mind to have, a clear narrative of what's happening, but realistically and practically it just doesn't translate to reality. And I think we have to be willing to say we are interested in dismantling the system of oppression and not just playing the game of who's the victim now, who's the oppressor now, because these things. And I think we see them all over, right? With all revolutions, also throughout the Middle East, what happened in Egypt and Iran, right? The people want a revolution. Of course, we all want a different reality for our region. And what happens when the revolution can sometimes be very, very dangerous, right? Of like what happens after, because there's all that chaotic energy. And so for me, as someone who is coming from the place that I am, it's like, I want justice for Palestinians. I want Palestinian liberation. I want an end to this apartheid system that, I think in systems of oppression, of course, the oppressed are the most impacted, but oppressors are in pain from oppression as well, right? And maybe that's a like advanced thing to say, but systems of oppression ultimately hurt everyone. This is why we talk about collective liberation, that all of our fate is bound up together, not because it's a nice thing to say, but because it's actually really real.
So where does one start to dismantle the system of oppression?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. One is that a really investigation into the inner self. That's the spiritual path. What are my thoughts? What are my beliefs? How am I contributing to this? Because, we all want other people to take responsibility, and we don't want to take responsibility because it's easy. But I found this in my personal life, both on a personal level and a collective level. When I step up and I say, I take responsibility for X, Y, Z, that actually, even at an energetic level, inspires others to do the same. If I'm coming from a defensive mode, you're gonna get defensive too, right? So it's kind of like we have to, be the ones who are willing to say this reality is beyond tragic, and I'm willing to just take a tiny step forward into some sort of miraculous future. And then once you do that, another person takes a step forward and another person takes a step forward. And then we can, make baby steps. Okay, we can be slow because it's very intense what we're working with. But then I think it's also, so there's that internal work, but I think it's also very essential that we do this relationship work. I think once you start loving someone who you deemed was an enemy, that's when the system collapses. And this is where, my personal belief that love truly disarms everything, even the biggest military in the world. I think love has the power to disarm that. And I see that on a practical level, and in my Palestinian, Jewish, Israeli, like all of this community, it's like we weren't all born into love and light. Some of us were in such intense circumstances. Some of us, were fueled by so much. Every single person who's part of this went through some sort of process. But I think that's the thing that's so beautiful, is that process and that transformation is actually always possible. And that's something that I bring from my Jewish faith, that, is like in the Talmud, there's all these stories of, the sages and the rabbis. They never would reject anyone. Even if they were the head of the gang violence, they were always welcome. Why? Because spiritual teachings, they welcome everyone. You could have done the most horrific crimes in the world, and because God is the most merciful, and because life has changed, and because we're all in this human evolution, and usually people who are committing things usually aren't doing that because they're evil, but are usually doing that because they're wounded and they're in pain, or they're ignorant, or all of these different things. So, that for me is the prayer, is, the opening of the spiritual teachings are actually open and available to anyone who chooses them, and anyone who chooses to come to them is welcome. That is a core belief for me that I'm always going to hold on to, and that comes from that place of like, I'm not here to reject anyone. So I think that process of transformation, there's something really, really deep there, and it happens through relationships. Because again, once you love someone who's impacted by the system, you collapse the system. Once you love someone who you're taught to hate, once you love someone who you had this whole narrative about, how could you still be holding up the system once you see how much you love this person?
Yeah, absolutely. In an article you wrote in the New Arab, you state, it's time to dismantle the narrative of coexistence. Why? Can you explain what you mean?
Yeah, of course.
I've done my research.
Yeah, you did. I love that. That was an article that was sitting in me for a really, really long time. And it came from an experience that I had in the city of Akka, which is one of my favorite cities. And, it comes from this understanding that unless we really face the truth as it is, as honestly as possible, we cannot move forward. And, a lot of the Israeli narratives of coexistence comes from a place of denial. It comes from a place of we don't want to reckon with the Nakba, we don't want to reckon with Palestinian suffering, we just want to coexist now. And a lot of the coexistence models are still coming from this place of power dynamics. They're not fully examining them. Whether that, in the gentrification of all of a sudden Israeli artists coming into a Palestinian city and, with their prices that are so high, or, sometimes there's Israeli hotels that are decked out with Palestinian aesthetics and food. And they genuinely don't think there's anything wrong with that. They're like, we're just trying to coexist with our neighbors. Meanwhile, their neighbors are being kicked out from their homes. They're not, receiving the proper legal care that they need, being attacked by settlers, getting threats. And it's like, that's not really a model of coexistence. And, it's hard to see because, in the Israeli consciousness, sometimes they truly don't get it. They're like, why don't these people want to coexist with us, And this is kind of, again, that narrative of like, we offered them a stage so many times and they always rejected it, right? It comes from that same place. And it's not really reckoning with Palestinian experience in a truthful way. It's still denying the levels of atrocities and the suffering and the continued harm that happens. So that is part of why I wrote that article, because I was getting really frustrated. And, it's like since Oslo, there was all these Israeli-Palestinian coexistence groups. And they were pretty much, about, okay, well, if we get kids to play together soccer in high school, maybe that will change something. Or if we get, these, but it didn't change something. Why? Because what happened is that when, they became 18, the Israelis served in the army and the Palestinians felt betrayed, and then they didn't talk again, right? So again, it's like, yeah, of course, the relationships are so important, but we also have to understand the system that is currently at place, because if we don't really reckon with that.
Yeah, that we did wrong.
And we did wrong. And, a lot of my friends kind of coined this co-resistance as opposed to coexistence, where it's just like, we are co-resisting together. We are co-resisting the system of oppression and this apartheid state. And that's where our relationship is coming from. Not from a place of just like, let's put flowers on the massacre, right? Because that's not going to lead us anywhere. And again, it comes from this place of we have to face the truth, however horrifying it is to look at and however uncomfortable it is. We cannot move forward unless we really face the past and the present. Yeah.
Yeah. I know in Israel there's a law against recognizing the Nakba, the violent mass expulsion of the indigenous Palestinians off their land. How do we acknowledge this event and how do we repair it?
Yeah, well, part of acknowledging it is understanding that it's still ongoing, right? It's not just something that happened in the past and now we're trying to commemorate it. And I think that's part of why it's so harsh for Israelis to reckon with. And yeah, I mean, there's still villages to this day that are getting displaced. So I think the recognition of the Nakba has to come with some sort of political activism that is, it's like, okay, this system has gone on for far too long and we're stopping it. Right? There needs to be like a break on that. And I think there also needs to be, right, like, I think again, like that this is at least what I've seen from being on the ground is that when you have these relationships and the people that you love, and when there's sharing of stories, that's when you start to really fathom it. Because, and I think this is similar also with Jewish pain or the Holocaust. I actually have a lot of critiques about this because people throw around the Holocaust all the time and they don't actually understand the individual stories. But I think there's something really powerful about the stories, especially coming from the mouth of someone that you love, because then you start to really reckon with it. And then you start to really feel it. And this is what personally happened to me and still happens to me. You know, when I hear of my Palestinian friends' pain, like, it doesn't feel like their pain. It feels like my pain too. Like, and I think that needs to be, that's the way that we recognize it. It's not like, oh, this is a thing that happened to them, right? It's like, whoa, like, this is all of this is here this is the whole land is feeling it. And, you know, this is actually really interesting because I see this on the Jewish side with anti-Semitism, because in the Jewish community, I feel like a lot of us have a lot of defenses. A lot of times we're not vulnerable with the world. We don't share our pain. We, you know, will criticize, we'll attack, we'll be like, you're being anti-Semitic, but we won't actually say, like, this is how it impacts me, and here, you know, that vulnerability, which I really believe that the vulnerability is that source of change. And I can see that from my personal experience. Like, I remember being in a community where something anti-Semitic happened, and I was crushed. I was crying for days. And at first I was really scared to talk about it with my non-Jewish friends, because, you know, usually when something, you call your Jewish friends, and I did, and I processed it with them. And I remember we were in a community circle with my, you know, all my non-Jewish friends, and I just cried in front of them for like an hour. And I could tell after that they were transformed, because they didn't just hear, oh, this is what anti-Semitism is, and and like that, you know, language, but they saw the impact of it. And I think that is where we express our pain in a vulnerable way. That's when it reaches people's hearts. And I think that I see that also with Palestinian narrative and Palestinian stories, but, and, you know, Palestinian experience. It's like when there's this vulnerability of like the pain, the vulnerability is always an invitation to come closer, you know, and it's a call for connection. So even energetically, there's a movement to come closer. When someone's like, here's my pain, I'm putting it on the altar, someone's gonna come close. So, I mean, and this is what, you know, I really believe in. We need these collective healing circles where we feel like we can express our pain, express our grievances, like be truthful, be held, be witnessed, you know, be understood. I don't know if that's possible, but that is, you know, that is for me the dream.
It's the dream. There's a dehumanization of Arabs and Muslims that makes it easy to perpetuate war. How do we go about that? What do we do about it?
Oof, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it makes me really, really angry to see that, to be honest, because I can really see it clearly in the media. And sometimes it also makes me angry because I feel that sometimes in my Jewish community, other Jewish people can't see that. You know, especially with like, if there's like a Hamas attack, and then people are like, no, but see, they are barbaric. What they did was barbaric, right? But missing that wider context, that this has been that narrative around Arabs and Muslims for decades. There's like a systemic interest in painting Arabs and Muslims that way. And yeah, I don't know how we fight it. I mean, I will say that it really hurts my heart in like a really deep way to see that. And the truth is that like, I do sometimes when I see that, I get a bit frozen, because I'm like, wow, this system is so big. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that I've been working with my Jewish community for a long time, is to recognize like, hey, we can't look at what's happening here without looking at the wider context of like, why is there this extreme dehumanization of Palestinians, of Arabs, of Muslims? Like, do we know that that's actually related to the dehumanization of our people as well, right? And yeah, and also just, you know, like, I think, I mean, there's so many multiple levels of that, right? But it's also the dehumanization of everything that the Middle East is, which is our spiritual practices, our culture, our food, and, you know, and I'm sure you experience this on some level where it's like, oh, okay, they dehumanize you, but then they want something exotic from you. It's like, oh, but I want this particular food, or I want
hummus is in Whole Foods, and you're like, do you know what hummus means? It's an Arabic word.
Yeah,
And it means chickpea.
totally.
And you've taken that from my culture.
Yeah.
And you've totally commercialized it.
Yeah, so just like seeing that dehumanization and then exotification of this, and that's something that I personally experience also, because when I travel in Europe, a lot of times people think I'm Muslim or, so sometimes, and there's a Mizrahi scholar who talks about it, that like anti-Semitism for Arab Jews a lot of the time is Islamophobia, right? Because sometimes we're read as being Muslims. So yeah, I think this is where, especially in the American left, we have a lot of work to do because our understanding of racism and systemic oppression, usually people don't have an analysis of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or anti-Arab racism. And it's kind of wild that we haven't been more, critical about understanding these systems.
Yeah, it's very narrow.
It's very narrow, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, the conversation around Palestine and Israel has become so intellectual. How do we shift this, and to where? And why is that important?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons why I think it's become very intellectual is because I think there's still so much patriarchal violence that the conversation is embedded in. Which means, right, patriarchal violence looks all sorts of ways. But one way is also thinking about this separation, either of the mind or the body, or the intellect and the emotional, right? The intellect is the masculine and the emotional is the feminine. And I think that we are still unconsciously, in a lot of ways, perpetuating this thing around the intellect is more powerful or more important than the emotional, right? We look at emotions as like, oh, look, this person's being dramatic, or this person, and of course that's
Too
also
sensitive.
yeah, oh, this person's too sensitive. Like that is also obviously feeding onto like Orientalist tropes also, which,
Everybody needs to read Edward Said.
yeah, for sure. So, I think that is also just the way that we police emotions. Or try to control emotions, and to say like, oh, you need to have like a clear intellectual argument in order for us to but that's not what's happening, because our emotions are exploding because the pain is so severe, and we're all crying out, and actually, as a feminist, I believe that emotions hold wisdom. They're not just, these chaotic expressions, but there's wisdom in the emotional body. And one of the wisdoms of the emotional body is that it helps guides us to the path of the heart, right? Because, in a lot of mystical traditions, we say that the path from the head to the heart is the longest you'll ever have to travel. Like you think it's from here to the moon, but actually moving from your head to the heart is much, much longer path. And I believe that. And I think emotions are actually the path to the heart, right? We can't actually, because this is what happens, right? We try to move from the head to the heart, and then we're in the heart, and what happens? We have a lot of pain. So we're like, I don't want to be there. But instead, we can go to the heart and we can say, okay, there's a pain, there's a anger, there's a grief, there's all these. And as we work through them layer by layer, we uncover the love back. And that's essential, because if we don't have the heart power, we actually don't have that much power. As much as mental intelligence is beautiful, and I'm also a thinker, and I love the reading and the intellectual argumentation, it's important and it has a role and it has a place. And if it's not integrated with the heart, we actually don't have enough power to dismantle systems of oppression, because again, the heart is that field of love that is connected to God, that is bigger than us, that actually the heart is where we are interconnected. This is where we remember. So I really believe that recovering that path to the heart is so, so, so essential. Like for me, at least, this has become my number one priority. It's like, how do I find my heart again? Where's the path? What are the avenues? And the emotional path, to me, is one of the strongest paths to get to the heart. And I believe that that's a very feminist model, right? To really go into the felt sense of the body, into the somatic, into the embodiment, into the experience of the body, to not reject it, but to say, hey, like, let me process this and let me understand that there's wisdom here that's going to guide me home.
Yeah. How do people start on that journey?
I think it's recognizing what is alive in you moment by moment. And at first it's hard because we don't even realize that there's something happening inside of us. But whether it's like, wow, I feel anger, I'm rageful, right? And it's like, maybe I want to take a pillow and scream in it, or, whatever it is, but like allowing for some emotional expression in a healthy way. I believe that's what's going to liberate us, right? Because there's so much charge in the emotional realm and the emotional body, and it's constantly being misdirected. And it's not to say that people aren't coming from valid places when they're saying certain things from emotional places, but it's just not as, as a spiritual person, I believe that like what we say is actually not as powerful as where we say it from, right? Because we see this all the time, right? Wisdom is actually quite simple. But you can tell when someone says a piece of wisdom and it's not integrated versus, spiritual teachers, they can say the same sentence, but they're saying it from a completely different place. So this is what I also believe, is that where we say something from is a lot more powerful than what we actually say. And this is what I, attempt to cultivate within myself, is like, how do I actually speak from a place of love, from a place of truth, from a place of integrity, and not from a place of wounding? If I respond from a place of wounding, then the other person will also respond from a place of wounding, and then we're in this cycle. So this is where, again, that responsibility of where do I want to be operating from? And understanding that I have power. When I make that choice, the other person is energetically going to meet me there, whether either of us are conscious of it or not. If I'm coming from a place of love, that's energetically sending you a signal to also come from a place of love. If I'm coming from a place of reaction, that's energetically sending a signal for you to also be reactive. Yeah. So this is, for me, how we start breaking the cycle bit by bit. And, I have kind of this saying that I've been saying to myself these days, where my prayer is that we transform reactionary violence into revolutionary love. So I really feel this is a process that we because the violence is so reactionary. It's like, they hurt me, and it's just like we're caught in that cycle. And we need to actually pause from that place and actually come back to the path of the heart, to the portal of love, and let that be our revolution. Because violence, at the end of the day, you can argue armed resistance, a justification, all of that. The result of violence is going to be more violence. This is just what's going to happen.
100%. And that's one of the reasons why I get so ill about this country funding so much violence.
Totally.
Because it's only going to create more.
Only more. Yeah, I mean, the military-industrial complex feeds off each other, right? And this is something we say a lot, that there's no military solution to our pain. Like, how are you going to have a military solution to pain? It doesn't make sense. It actually doesn't make sense. Like, the pain just intensifies.
Yeah, and when you realize that the military-industrial complex is all about power, control, money, then you're like, wow.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, when like people are profiting from you being in pain.
100%, yeah. It's so obvious. When you see it, you can't unsee it.
Definitely.
How do we not lose ourselves in the storyline and fall victim to the tactic of divide and conquer? Emotional reactivity throws us off our center. How do we see ourselves in each other and shine our light through the very real and often heartbreaking world?
I recently ran into a Sufi friend, and he reminded me that the purpose of life is to break your heart. And he's like, it's a bit depressing. But, it's not like this, let's just like be happy, go lucky and go vacation. Like, it's a bit more of a realistic view. So actually, when your heart breaks, that's a good sign. because, and this is where it gets into a greater spiritual understanding of who we are and why we are here. Which, for the most part, people don't really ask themselves these questions, but I find that they're essential, especially in times like this, because if you don't have spiritual skills, it's really hard to, intervene in any of these divide and conquer, emotional reactivity. We just get too attached to the storyline, to all of these things. And we forget that we are actually only here for a temporary time. Ultimately, we're all here temporarily. As much as, I say, I come from here, you come from there, none of us actually will remain on earth for that long. We all will return into the spiritual field. So, and this is also, my belief, that I believe in God, and my belief in God means that God is a just God. And I believe that there's a universal justice system that is always governing, right? This is part of this understanding that God is the all-knowing, the all-seeing. Like, there's nothing you can do and get away with, because it's all seen. So this is where, that surrender practice comes. I don't have to hold on so much as like, no one's seeing my pain, because God is seeing my pain. And I will be honest, I get into these places all the time. Like, I don't think we need to be perfect about it. It's okay to be emotionally reactive. It's okay to, get attached to a story, all these different things, because this is human life. This is a human process. I think that one of the ways that we resist falling into these traps is through the building of community, because community helps us orient. And I want to say that, there's different kinds of community, and I see some of us get trapped in this, where there's community that's oriented around trauma bonding, which basically means that we validate each other's traumas and then we don't heal them, right? It's like we complain together about the same experience, and then we just cycle about that. And that happens a lot in a lot of communities, right? We just trauma bond. But my interest is into communities of liberation, which means that we actually heal the trauma, which means that we have to challenge one another. Why are you holding that narrative? Not just validating your narrative. And this is where it requires, right, the psychological skills, the emotional tools, which, thank God, we have so many blessed healers and people who have studied so much to understand how our psyches are wired. I think the psychological work is such a big part of this. But I think these communities of liberation, they have to be diverse. If you find yourself that you only have, and this is true for anyone and anything, right? If you find yourself that your whole community is just the same identity, there's an issue there that you're not really confronting something, right? Because when you have diverse community, when you have people in your community that are deemed as like the enemy, that's when you have to face yourself. You constantly have to face yourself. And this is why people don't do that, because they're scared of facing themselves. But when we have that community of liberation, of diversity, we also have this accountability of like, no, we're going to consistently challenge each other to grow. And I'll say also something that is related to that. A big part of my interest is also researching Andalusia and like the Golden Age, and what happened there. What made it the Golden Age? What made it this place of so much spirituality and philosophy and poetry, and part of it is because there was diversity. And it sounds so silly to say, because it's like, well, of course, diversity strengthens everyone. But and even in just the Jewish community itself, you can see that how philosophers held different understandings of God, and they were in conversation with each other. And because they were in conversation, they sharpened each other's analysis. And from there was such brilliance and such emanation of light. Because they didn't, fight and were like, oh, your understanding of God is wrong, yours is, because then we kind of deplete into lower frequencies. But there's a way of actually holding that healthy disagreement into an elevation of light. And I think that's part of what we're trying to learn, right? And something that I think that, fascism lives off of a singular narrative. And I don't think we're as aware of how often in our communities we fall into this.
Oh, absolutely.
This is a narrative. This is a truth. This is the ideology. This is the enemy. That is fascism. That's the bedrock of fascism, right? The golden age is around the complexity, is around the multiplicity, is around the diversity. And this is where, I am personally trying to move to. And it honestly frightens me in all sorts of community to see how much they're clinging on to one narrative. And there's also like, something I've been realizing lately is that politics or political opinions are less about this morality or justice lens, but it's more about either people pleasing, right? People want to fit in and they're like, well, my friends are saying this, so I'll say this too, right? Which again is also a fascism, like group psychology reality, or it becomes from like an emotional place, right? Narrative is built off of unprocessed emotions. And this is why, right, the practice of spirituality is really learning to let go of everything, even your own identity. How are you going to let go of your own identity or your identity? But this is the spiritual path is the letting go. And the more that we're holding on to narrative, we're actually holding on to unprocessed pain. Mm-hmm. So we can feel that we're righteous. And a lot of us do. It's like, oh, I have this narrative. It makes sense. I feel right. But what happens ultimately in my life, and maybe it doesn't happen to me right now, maybe it'll take 10 years, 20 years, but I will eventually suffer. Maybe chronic health issues, mental health issues, something will start to break down. Because when I am coming at my reality from that place, I'm actively hurting myself. And I think, this is something that we don't talk a lot about, especially in the US, where we are just facing such massive health issues. And for me personally, as a spiritual person, I can see how that is directly tied to the narratives we hold about reality. And, there's a lot of trauma experts who are talking about this, doing this work. But, I really believe that in order for us to find health again in our system, we have to look at what beliefs am I holding on to that are hurting me. And usually those beliefs that are hurting me are ones that are dehumanizing other people.
Yeah. Oh, how true.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to, when we spoke earlier, you told me about maybe a liberation retreat or some retreat you went to where it was all about facing trauma, and you basically raised your hand and asked a really provocative question. Can you just tell us briefly about that?
I was in Jerusalem, and, I think that there's a lot of people interested in trauma healing, coming to help the region, healing the trauma of Israel, Palestine, all of this. And there was one person who organized a day-long trauma healing session. And the invitation, was very much, like, I'm very careful, especially when I'm in Jerusalem, at, like, what places I choose to go to, what places I don't go to, because, I'm very aware of the apartheid system, the segregation system, and even, like, I'm invited a lot of times to teach Judaism, and it's complicated for me because I don't personally want to teach Judaism just for Jewish, like, there's something that feels off for me to, like, teach in a way where I know Palestinians are excluded, right? There's a tension there for me. And I only really like to be in spaces that are really conscious of, like, also there's space for Palestinians to be here with us. Because otherwise it feels like we're just reenacting. But anyways, the invitation was, open to all leaders. It said Arabs, Palestinians, Jews. So it's like, okay, I'll go. And then I went, and it wasn't even just Israelis, but it was mostly American Ashkenazim. And I was really disappointed because I felt that how are we going to have this trauma conversation if we are not having the people in the room that need to be here? It doesn't make sense. We're just, again, in that echo chamber, we're perpetuating our own narratives. So I asked the question, how can we talk about trauma when Palestinians aren't here, where mostly Mizrahim aren't here, Ethiopians aren't here, Bedouins aren't here, so many groups of people are missing. And thank God the facilitator took it quite well and actually did a breakout room, which was like, okay, how about we just turn to, a couple people next to us and actually talk about who's not here and why. And I think that conversation is really important. Now I kind of want to do it in every space that I go into, like who's not here and why, because sometimes we don't ask these questions. We just live our life. But for me at this point, like I'm very sensitive to these things, like on all sides, if I'm like at something, in the land and it's just like explicitly excluding Palestinians, like I'm not going to be part of that. But also, I feel that also sometimes on like Arab community organization stuff where it's just like they're so scared of having any Jewish people there that it's just like, why, So this is again coming back to the place that we are just so segregated. And yes, we're segregated because there's a like apartheid wall, and we're also mentally segregated. We are so mentally segregated, we can't even conceive of having communities together anymore. We can't even imagine it, you know?
Yeah. Why is it so important to decolonize our mind, our body, and our soul?
Yeah, well, so I think that part of it, what is colonization? It's a lot of things, but one way I like to think about it is that it's a separation of the body from the land, right? It's this rupture that happens between people and land. And the body and the land is the most powerful connection one can have. And when you are literally ruptured at your root, you are destabilized. You are destabilized spiritually, you are destabilized ancestrally, and you lose your power because the land is your anchor. So, and I think this is part of the time that we're living in. We're living in a time of massive global displacement and and colonization and so much issues in our global world. But I think part of that is this reckoning of how does a body return to land, right? And what does that process look like? And this is something that, sometimes in the Jewish community, right, there's kind of that narrative of, okay, Jews were in exile from Palestine and then they returned. And I challenge that narrative because is returning to the land enough? Is it now, if your body will be on the land that you're from, is that enough to decolonize? And I believe that it's not, because it's not actually about just the material conditions. It's also about the psychological and spiritual conditions. And if we don't address them, then we'll be in the state that we are in now, which is this oppressive regime. Because, the Jewish people, we did have our trauma healing time. We went from severe oppression into statehood. And, I always think about that Hannah Arendt, which, I think everyone should read everything she's written. But, she really predicted everything that would happen now. And she was writing in like the 40s, she's a German Jew. And as the state of Israel was created, she wrote letters to all the Jewish leaders at that time. And she said, the Jews are not psychologically fit for a state right now. If they do this, it's going to turn into disaster and into a totalitarian fascist regime. Oof. In the 40s, imagine that coming out of the Holocaust. So, and leftist Jewish community, we always have the slogan, like, Arendt was right. Like, yeah, it's really, really powerful. But I think there's something true about that. And I don't think it's also particular to Jewish people, right? People who've suffered oppression, it's like we can't just like return to the land and then it's fine. We actually need to go through a process of reckoning with the psychology of oppression, with the spiritual return, right? Like and this is where I think that the spiritual path, right, is also there to remind us that yes, the land is our home, but the land isn't really our soul home. It's our temporary home ultimately, because our bodies are temporary. So we can't really get that attached to the land, right? Because we can't get that attached to our bodies. And in a spiritual perspective, we are the soul, we're not the body, right? So if I'm the soul, the quest is to return home, which is to God's heart. It's not to anything material, And this is what I love so much about Kabbalah, because in Kabbalah we have this teaching that the whole world can basically be understood through these relationship between the light, which is God's light, and the vessel, right? The vessel is a container that holds God's light. And we're all the time trying to kind of reconcile how the vessel holds the light. And sometimes if the vessel is empty, it's not really worth much, because what I'm searching for is the light of God, right? So sometimes, I think this is so true even just in personal life. It's like, I think I want this thing, this material thing. Oh, if I just go, I daydream about this vacation there or having this car or whatever it is. And then we get it and it feels empty because the light isn't there. So this is that understanding of that soul nature, right? Which is just like, which by the way, I feel a lot of times in Jerusalem, which is just like, as much as I have such a complicated relationship to the city, but like as much as I really deeply love this land, sometimes I'm there and it feels empty to me. Like, what is this land? Like, and as I said to you, I think before, that in Kabbalah we have this teaching that, the divine feminine is in exile from Jerusalem. So if God's light is not there, what is it? And for me, yeah, I'm personally interested in the light of God. I'm not interested in empty material. And this is what we talk about, right? The body is alive once the soul is in it. When the soul leaves the body, what is the body worth? So sometimes we get so attached to the material dimension of things that we forget about the spiritual existence. And to go back to that question about decolonization, to me, true decolonization is that return all the way home, is that return to that spiritual self. Because really, if we don't do that work all the way through, then we're just going to continue to suffer. The only true liberation is a spiritual one.
From a spiritual lens, what are pain and suffering here to teach us?
Well, they're really here to awaken us to our reality. Because as much as we don't want to suffer, the truth is when we don't suffer, we don't do spiritual practice, right? In our everyday life, I am in my routine. I go to work, I do this thing, and I always say, oh, when I'll have time, I'll examine this part of me. Or when I have time, I'll go to therapy or whatever it is. And when suffering comes out, and depends, right? There's different levels of suffering, different levels of pain. But sometimes the pain can be so intense that the only option you have is to feel and is to confront and is to be on your path. And, sadly, we as humans, we have a hard time learning outside of suffering, like spiritually at least. And we have this concept in Judaism, in the Talmud, that's called Yisurin shel Ahava, which means sufferings of love. Which I'm always so fascinated by this concept of like, what does that mean? Sometimes God sends us suffering as a way of love, as a way to elevate us, right? And I think, one of the biggest ways is through grief and through loss, because what does that do? It helps us to awaken to the fact that we're all dying. The longer we live, the closer we are to death, right? We're going to lose people that we love along this path. And when there's loss, there is an activation of purpose. Because then I am, sharp, and I'm like, okay, I don't have that much time left. This person in front of me might not be here tomorrow. How do I want to show up right now? It really, if you let it, suffering can cleanse your soul so fast, right? Because you just all of a sudden realize what's important and what's not. And we see that throughout history, right? Whenever there's extreme suffering, all of a sudden we see humanity showing up with care, with kindness, like people coming out of the street offering food, like all of these different ways that humanity's activated.
Through suffering.
Yeah.
What work do we need to do to not pass on our trauma?
Oof. First of all, I want to say that we will pass off our trauma. And I don't think that's bad, actually, because this is a cycle of life, right? This is how evolution works, is that I am gifted a life and I can do what I can do. I can't do everything. I actually can't, because I'm limited, and also things will happen to me that will probably be traumatizing. But there's always going to be more life. That's the thing that's so beautiful about life, is that it keeps going. There's nothing that can kill life. Life will always grow.
Even after we're long gone.
Even after we're long gone. So whatever I'm not able to do, the life force is going to continue on to do what I couldn't do. That's why this is where the most beautiful teaching of that surrender. It's really liberating, because sometimes I feel like in the psychological world, we're like, oh, I have to heal all my trauma so I can date properly, or so I can fit in, or so I can say something eloquent. But the truth is that the life force, this is how healing happens. The healing happens not when we effort, but when we let go, when we actually are effortless, because the life force on its own is healing, right? Like, you go out to nature and you're instantly healed. Why? Because nature is healing. That's the life force. So it's this practice of surrendering and letting go to the life force. And that's actually organically going to happen. From this high level spiritual view, we're all going to be liberated. regardless of what choice me and you make today. This is our destination, and we're on the path, and we're going. It might take 500 million years, but this is the destination, and it's unquestionable. So then, if that's a destination and it's unquestionable, it awakens me to say, how do I want to show up right now? Do I want a longer path of suffering, or do I want a shorter one? So then I can be a light to the world and also help heal humanity together.
What would freedom, justice, and healing for the Holy Land look like?
Wow. So many things. We have so much healing to do. I mean, one, absolutely freedom of movement for all people living in the land, and right of return for Palestinians. That's, number one. It's like really just taking down the borders, which are borders in our mind, they're cages in our heart, right? They're oppressing us from the inside, right? We can't live like this anymore. None of us can. And yeah, and I think, I had a Palestinian friend who said this to me one time, and he's like, if the colonization didn't happen when the Jews came, if the Jews really just came and we just created a shared society together, it would have been the most beautiful thing in the world. And I still hold on to that. And I don't know if it's possible, not possible, because really the trauma is extreme and the violence is extreme. And I really feel that. It's like, wow, Palestinian and Jews have so much in common. We have our friendship, our community, our traditions, our gatherings. It's like the art we make, the writings we write, like there's so much brilliance, there's so much beauty, there's so much richness, like spiritual richness there. And for me, my prayer is that the healing, the freedom, the justice, all of that happens in the Holy Land, it's not just for us. It's an emanation for the whole world. And this is where we said that, what happens there affects the whole entire world. And I really believe that. And I think that we have been tasked with this great spiritual task to really deeply bring the spiritual light into the entirety of the world. And I will say that part of that healing and that freedom and, all of that, part of it, I mean, of course, it's multi-religious. Of course, it's, multi-everything. Everyone is welcome. I mean, the city of God is open to everyone. That is my dream, that the city of God, it's kind of like the tent of Abraham and Sarah, that we say, that they didn't have any walls to their tent because everyone was welcome. And this is where that can only happen if you're rooted in love. Love is unafraid of anything because everything it touches is transformed into love, because that's the truth of reality. So there's no reason to actually be scared, which is why the teachings of Abraham and Sarah are so deep around this hospitality, right? Which I think, the Abrahamic religions, like this is the core of it. We are supposed to be open to the entire world so that the light of God can come through us. And I will say that for me, that also means feminist light, right? It means a divine feminine. It's not just this fiery masculine, but it's also this watery feminine. Something I pray for a lot is for that watery quality to grace the land, right? To grace Jerusalem, this womb-like, this compassionate, like the waters of the world. This is what gives us life, and we need more life, so we need more water.
We do.
Yeah.
Oh. When did you come to understand that you had wounds and trauma that needed healing? And how did that influence your fight for Palestinian liberation?
Yeah, I think I realized pretty young. I mean, it's hard not to. You grow up with such extreme conditions in Jerusalem, and a lot of the families, right? The war, the trauma, it doesn't just stay out in the streets, it comes home. So you see it in your parents and so, I grew up in not the most stable environment. So it was pretty obvious that there was a lot of pain. As a child, I couldn't understand it necessarily politically. That took time. But I feel really grateful because I realized pretty young, I think when I was 18, pretty much, I was like, the second that I became an adult, I realized, if I don't clean my wounds, I will perpetuate them. I will hurt people I love, and I don't want this future for myself. I want to love. I think that was actually, that was the deepest motivation for me, is that I was like, I want to know what love is. And in order to do that, I need to face myself. And so pretty much right away, I did everything to get into therapy. And I was very deep into therapy for like 3-4 years. That's basically the only thing I did in my younger 20s. And I really was so blessed, so lucky. You know, I met such incredible healers who were so graceful with me, and, you know, just dove into the books and into the meditations and into all of that. And, you know, I think that it is true, is that the more you clean up your trauma, the more capacity you have to understand other people's traumas, which is why I choose the path of compassion right now, because sometimes people are in their trauma state and they don't have capacity to hold someone else's trauma. And I actually think that's okay. That is where they are. And, you know, the more that I work on my trauma, the more that I can hear someone else. And, you know, for me personally, I was pretty involved in a lot of justice struggles, like right away, like in college, and Occupy Wall Street and fight against racism and fight for feminism. So it became pretty clear, you know, once you're in all those struggles, like it's not that hard to actually see what's happening in Palestine is related to all of it. It really isn't hard. I think it's only hard if you are still in your trauma state, which is, I think, where I've really learned that it's not about the facts. It's not about the intellectual arguments. It's about the healing that people need to be able to really face what's happening. You know, and this is something that I feel a lot of pain around, you know, sometimes in the Jewish community. And I think a lot of Jews feel this, where, you know, we just see such a blatant denial sometimes in our communities of what's happening to Palestinians and of the Nakba. And it's like, how? How can you just deny something that's so basic, right? Or even just that Israel's an apartheid state. Like every human rights organization says that, like even Israeli ones. Like, how can there still be this denial, you know? And you know, and I'm sure you feel that anger too, right? Because it's like, it's maddening. You're like, this is what's happening in reality. Like you can go to the West Bank, you can see what's happening, and it's just real and it's just true, and no one's making up anything. And I think what I've learned also is that trauma clouds your perception. And denial, the reason why people deny things is not because they, you know, in their heart of hearts can't, like they just don't have the capacity to deal with the pain of what it would mean to face that. And I think that that is true of a lot of choices we as humans make, is that, you know, sometimes we see all these avoidances, this, a lot of it just comes to capacity. People don't have capacity to face the pain within them. So they choose all sorts of strategies to deny, to hide, to avoid. But it just comes to this place of pain. And I think this is what it means to develop a compassionate heart, is to understand that people are not doing this because they're evil or because they want to. They just actually don't have another way. And yeah. And
it seems like the work is to build capacity.
Yeah.
Right?
That's personally what I believe, which is why, you know, I did a lot of political work, and there was a moment for me, it was actually because I built a Mizrahi community, that I was wanting to build a Mizrahi Palestinian solidarity group. And even just getting Mizrahim together was too traumatizing. Like all of our trauma exploded on one another, and we couldn't move. Like even within anti-Zionist Mizrahi, like, you know, we were a small group of people, and even between us, like our trauma was just exploding on one another. And it's like, I was like, okay, how are we gonna now do solidarity with Palestinians if we can't even work out together? So I think that for me is when I had a very strong awakening to, like, the path needs to be spiritual. Because if we don't have the spiritual skills, our trauma will continuously get in the way. And this is where I'm still, of course, doing political stuff, but for me, the center is spirituality. Because when we have spiritual skills, when we have spiritual tools, we can start to, you know, unpack the political.
Was there a moment that kind of, like, basically triggered this Jewish-Palestinian solidarity, or did it just kind of happen gradually?
I think it was through my relationship with Palestinians that felt the most organic and natural thing in the world. I was like, oh, of course, we are friends and we are together. And, you know, like, I want to show up for you, and I want to understand like what my people are doing to your people, and I want to stop that, and I want, to recover however much we can this lineage connection that we have to this land. So yeah, I think for me it was definitely through this relationships and just really how natural it was for me and how safe it felt for me to be with Palestinians. Really feeling such deep safety, and especially with Palestinian men, which I think it's like, yeah, as you're saying, there's so much dehumanization of Arabs in the media, and especially of Palestinian men. And this is something that, for me, it's like my experience with Palestinian men has been like, they're just so feminist and so, like one time there was this, with a group of Palestinian men in like the middle of the night in the desert. And this is something that, is like, we were taught as like the worst fear. And I was the only woman, also only Jewish. And it was like full moon, and they were all praying to the moon. And I'm just like, these are the people that I'm taught to fear, the people who are like, just being in devotion to the moon right now. Like, this is the most beautiful thing ever. And there wasn't any fear of me. And I'm like, they're dancing to the moon,
I love that so much.
Yeah.
So you moved to LA for a fellowship called Abrahamic House. Could you briefly tell us what that is? And you've been working on a project called Jerusalem in Exile. Can you tell us a little bit about it and how it supported your healing?
So Abrahamic House was a fellowship, a social change incubator that brought together people of different faith to live together and create community. Unfortunately, this happened right when COVID pandemic spread, so we weren't able to create community in person. We had virtual events, but we lived together. It was 4 of us. I was a Jewish fellow, there was a Muslim fellow, a Christian fellow, and Baha'i fellow. And it was a really beautiful experience because we were living together during a pandemic, so it brought us really close together. We had dinners, we celebrated all of our holidays together, really showed up for one another. We studied scripture together. We did like religion 101 classes where we each kind of shared. And, it's so complicated also doing religion 101 because, and we each, it's funny, I remember we each said this so much where it's just like, I'm sharing with you the particular Judaism that I practice. It's not like the Judaism because there's so many Judaisms. And, that's true for every faith, right? There's so much diversity within every faith. But yeah, it was a really beautiful fellowship, and this kind of multi-faith work I think is so critical and so important. And also, I personally love it. I personally love learning about other people's paths towards God, and we were a very devotional group, very justice-oriented group, so we were all very aligned. And they're still some of my closest friends to this day. I really wish everyone could do it on some level, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, seeing someone else's perspective. It's
Yeah.
like the most important thing in the world.
And like living together and just seeing them as human, it's like, oh, this is how and it's funny because then you start getting into the rhythms. You're like, oh, on Ramadan, this is how my Muslim friend, like, for me, Shabbat every Friday is really important. So like I always give flowers or, just these like small things that you're like, oh, this is how these people track time. This is how they orient their life. And
yeah, I mean, living in Lebanon, it's like you always celebrated all the holidays with all your friends. It was just an excuse for more celebration.
And I love that. I think that's so beautiful, Yeah.
It's just how it is.
Yeah.
Which was one of my favorite things about growing up there. Can you just tell us about your project, Jerusalem in Exile, and how that supported your healing?
Yeah, so Jerusalem in Exile is an art project, performance art project that I started a few years ago that was basically the premise of twofold. One is really tracing how Jewish exiles transferred onto Palestinian exile through investigation of trauma and somatics, and really expanding this understanding of exile into a psychological and spiritual one. Kind of as I said, like I think in the Jewish perspective, sometimes there's this thing of like, oh, we return to the land, we return to Jerusalem, so our exile is over. But internally, there's still so much fear and terror, and which leads to occupation and apartheid that is really just built on these emotional experiences of fear and terror, really. So for me, that's not really a return from exile if you're still A, living in such fear, and B, like causing that trauma onto other people. So it's kind of looking at what does that look like from a spiritual and psychological perspective to like heal exile, which again is also looking at exile from that spiritual perspective, where it's like exile is really about our human souls seeking to return to God. Happens to be convenient because Jerusalem's a city of God, so it has all these meta levels. But then the second premise is also looking at, when we think about exile, we think about people being in exile. But I'm really interested in what it means for land to be in exile, and specifically for Jerusalem, right? Because Jerusalem is a city of God, is supposed to be a multi-faith, open city. And right now it's a racially segregated apartheid city. So Jerusalem is not living up to her manifestation, her potential. And that's a tragedy. So, yeah, and I think that, and that's something that I learned from my grandma, to just listen to the land and understand the pain of the land, the desires of the land. And this is actually how the project came about. It wasn't like this, it really felt like it came from the land. And I felt like I was just following it.
I want to know how we can heal all Abrahamic religions together.
Yeah. Truthfully, I really believe that it's through the divine feminine. Because I think I think there isn't a single religion on earth that hasn't been impacted by patriarchy and has had the teachings be distorted through that lens of patriarchy. And I think that there is something about the divine feminine in Islam and in Judaism and in healing together, and this is where I really love all the interpretations together of the story of Sarah and the story in Hagar, and this is where the wound is, right? And what does it look like, the sisterhood unification, which is really into that divine feminine light. I think that is, and I think this is turning out to be more and more true. Just like I said that I can't really understand my Judaism without Islam, I don't really believe I can heal without Muslims healing with me. I just don't believe it's possible. Maybe, but I believe that somehow our fates have been to heal together. And again, we can run away from it. A lot of prophets in Judaism run away from their callings, and eventually, either God eats them in the whale, like Jonah, or whatever happens. But we will return to the mission that we are here for. And I think it's become pretty clear that the only forward way is together. And I really believe that making that space for the divine feminine is part of that path.
I think I 100% agree with you there. It's like,
Yeah.
I have deep reverence for the divine feminine, so I so agree with you there.
And it's also so interesting, the story of the dancing to the moon. Like in Judaism and Islam, we have such reverence for the moon. We orient our time by the moon. It's already embedded in our consciousness, in our traditions, this light of the moon. And I think we need to understand what that really is about. What is the moon? What is that reverence about? It's really deep and it's really mystical and it's very feminine.
Awesome. In addition to being an activist, spiritual leader, a writer, you also weave prayer shawls. Will you share with us a little bit more about this ancient tradition?
Yeah, so prayer for me is really the heart of my faith. It's actually tied to this activism because when you're in prayer, the word Baruch, right? We say in Hebrew Baruch, or is like the first word of a lot of prayers that we say. But etymologically, it actually comes from knee. Because prayer is to bend your knee.
To bow down.
And to bow down, exactly. So when we say Baruch, we bend. And I find that to be really, really beautiful because, it's the opposite of a militaristic stance. Because
Another parallel to Islam, too.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, in that way, in the prayer, yeah. The militaristic stand is like, I can't afford to not see what's even behind me, right? So I have to be alert. I have to stand tall. I have to look around. I need to understand fear from all direction, kind of this. But the prayer stance is, I'm going to kneel, and I'm actually going to put my forehead to the ground. And, logically, it doesn't really make sense that that would be a position of safety, right? Because you actually don't see anything when you're kneeling. But this is actually the true spiritual prayer. It's because we're closing our physical eyes and we're opening our spiritual eyes. And that is what I find so beautiful. And this is actually where I came into that prayer weaving, prayer rugs, prayer shawls, where I was just like, wow, what is this practice of just surrendering, of saying, I don't need to be in defense. I don't need to be in attack. I absolutely trust that God is my protector. It's a very, very high level to get to.
Goosebumps all over my body.
That's to me the practice of prayer. Is like I surrender my weapons, whether they're mental, emotional, or physical. I surrender all of them and I say, God is my true protector.
Sometimes it feels like spiritual practices like prayer shawls and making art can't possibly help in the face of so much suffering. What would you say to that person who feels discouraged from doing small, beautiful things just because they worry it might not make a difference?
Well, first of all, I would say that we don't know. And when I say we don't know, we mostly don't know anything, really. We don't know the impacts of our actions. And this is part of the secret of life, is to act with faith even without knowing. We don't know how, in Judaism, there's a teaching, we have all these laws. And it says that we don't actually know which ones are better than the others or which one count more than the other. Because we're not really supposed to know. We're supposed to just do them, whether they're big or they're small, right? Even the smallest action can be the most powerful. So, I think that there's something there about also that surrendering to the unknown and choosing to listen internally to what is most aligned. Because your heart does not lie. Your heart does not lie to you. And even for me, I'll say that I struggle with this as well, because sometimes it feels like, what is it worth, anything that I'm doing? And I really don't know, and sometimes I've done stuff that, I did this thing and then it took 10 years for there to be any impact. Did that mean it wasn't impactful, or does that mean that it actually was very impactful? It just needed to take that time. And, there's a kind of spiritual story around, just like if the stove is hot and we put our finger onto it, we actually don't know we don't feel the burn right away. It takes a couple of seconds, right? And then once we feel it, it's actually the same thing with our actions. We do something, we don't feel it right away. It takes a couple of seconds, sometimes lifetimes, right? So we live in a world where there isn't this direct cause and effect. I don't really know the consequences of my actions, probably until Judgment Day or whatever your belief system is. This is where the place of faith comes from, that I strengthen my faith, I strengthen my devotion, I strengthen my listening. I think listening is so important. And then I'm guided by that. And it's okay to have uncertainty. It's not, actually it's recommended to have uncertainty. If I was certain about everything I would be doing, I would be in an egotistical, narcissist place,
Awesome. I wanted to ask you to share a Jewish Sufi prayer to close. But before that, do you feel there's anything left unsaid? Is there anything about your work in the world right now? Or is there anything about, I know you mentioned maybe wanting to talk more about Palestinian liberation. Is there anything that feels unsaid that you'd like to say before we close with a prayer?
I feel like we actually said it all. I feel... Well, just thank you so much. Thank you for having me on this conversation. This was such an honor and such a pleasure. And for listening and for opening and for inviting. It's so generous, and I feel really blessed to be here sitting with you and having this conversation.
Me too. Me too, very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah, should we?
Yeah, I'll do more. It's more like a teaching.
Oh, teaching. Great.
Teaching prayer.
Yeah, I love it.
I'll be twofold. So, there's two things that I want to offer. One is this really beautiful thing that you actually started off by talking about, which is remembrance. And in Jewish tradition, we call that zecher. The word is zecher or zikaron. And we use that for almost all of our holidays. Every holiday, it's like zecher l'maseh bereshit, in remembrance of the act of creation, or zecher, to, the Exodus, or there's always something about remembering who we are, remembering where we come from, remembering God. And, there's something that really hit me when I was in Sufi zikr, which that word zikr is it's the same word, right? Zecher and zikr. They're about this remembrance because, Jewish tradition teaches that we are actually, when we're in the womb, we know everything. We know the whole Torah, we know all the spiritual teachings. And when we come out of the womb, right, when we're born, there's an angel that comes and taps us on the fulcrum right here. This is why we have a little indent. And we forget everything. And then our whole spiritual life is about remembering. So I think that's really powerful because it's not about learning something new. Spirituality is not about discovering something new. It's actually about unlearning and returning and remembering to what we already knew. It's already in our bones. It's already in our souls. And that is just such a profound way of thinking about that. And, in Judaism, so much of our rituals are rituals of remembrance, right? When we light Shabbat candles, it's like a testimony to creation and the light of the world. And, there's always these small acts of rituals of remembrances. So that's one offering. And then the second, which is really, to me, the essence of my faith and my teachings, which is, we have this, and it's so funny. We say the same prayers. We really say the same prayers, which in Hebrew we say the El Rachum B'Chanun, the God that is most merciful and compassionate, which is El Rachman El Rachim. And, God also in Judaism has many names, and many, there's many aspects or many names of God that we can chant to bring up different attributes of God. But the El Rachum B'Chanun is so powerful because we received this teaching when Moses went up to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. And, he went up the first time and then he came down with the tablets. And when he came down with the tablets, he saw the ancient Israelites, right, serving the golden calf, idol worshiping, and he smashed the tablets. And God was very angry. God actually wanted to wipe out the people and was like, this was too much for me. This crossed a red line. No. And Moses had to go up a second time to receive the Torah. And when he went up the second time, he also had, in Judaism, we say the role of the prophet is to be the mediator between the people and God and to really awaken the compassionate aspect of God, the aspect of forgiveness. Because God was like, I don't want to forgive these people. Why would they do something like that to my teachings, right? Why would they turn away from my teachings? And Moses had to pray and had to, remind God of God's nature. And God was eventually, swayed and was like, okay, we're going to give the teachings a second time. But before I give you the teachings, I want to teach you a prayer. And this prayer you're going to have forever with you as a secret code that when my anger overcomes my compassion, if you say this prayer, I will remember my compassion. And we will be returned into that unity state. And the prayer is called the 13 attributes in Judaism, but it's the El Rachum B'Chanun. It's the God that is most infinitely loving, compassionate, and merciful. And I think that this story is so powerful because we got that before we got the 10 commandments. That's how powerful this prayer is. It's like before any of the law, we have the teaching that God is compassionate and infinitely merciful. And this is a secret. And I really believe that this is a secret to all life, is to remembering the compassionate one. And, and of course in Sufism and Islam, is this not the central teaching, right? Do we not say Rahman al-Rahim, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and almost everything? So I think that this remembrance of the compassionate one, which is also this remembrance that any suffering, in Judaism we say before suffering was created, the healing for that suffering was created. There's no suffering that cannot be healed because ultimately God is the most merciful, compassionate one, and that is the God that we pray for. We don't pray to a vengeful God, and we don't pray for a judgmental God. We pray to the compassionate God. And the last thing I'll just close and say that in the Talmud it says, sometimes when we want to be close to God, we don't know how. It's like, who is God? So instead of, trying to understand who God is, we just emulate the ways of God. Just as God is merciful and compassionate, so to you be merciful and compassionate. And this is the path to knowing God. So this is my prayer and this is my offering as we are delving into very deep trauma vortexes of such ongoing violence and such deep pain and grief and anger and all of this, that we come to this place of remembering together, remembering our lineages and remembering that God is truly the most merciful one and that there's nothing that can't be held in the divine light.
I love that so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend. You can connect with Into Healing on TikTok and Instagram for more inspirational and behind-the-scenes content, and visit our website, intohealing.com, for transcripts and other goodies. Into Healing is made possible thanks to people like you. Contributions made through Venmo @IntoHealing or through our website, intohealing.com, help us bring you more inspiring episodes. This has been Into Healing with Mira Adura. Thank you for joining us.